History isn't just what happened. It's what survived the people who decided what was worth keeping. Entire kingdoms were deliberately unnamed. Treaties signed, then shredded. Populations relocated so completely that even the word for where they came from disappeared. This isn't conspiracy. It's just how power has always worked, quietly, at the edges of the official record. Tonight, we're not chasing mystery for its own sake. We're reading the gaps, the silences between documented events where entire human lives once existed. Get comfortable. This is the history nobody filed away properly. High in the mountains of eastern Anatolia, where the borders of modern Turkey, Iran, and Armenia converge, the land rises sharply into a cold, unforgiving plateau. Ancient volcanic peaks dominate the skyline. Lake Van, vast, alkaline, eerily still, stretches across the basin like a mirror no one dares look into too long. It is a place that feels perpetually on the edge of something. Watched. Held in suspension between one era and the next. This is where Urartu was born. For nearly 3 centuries, roughly 860 to 590 BC, the Kingdom of Urartu controlled one of the most strategically significant corridors in the ancient world. It sat at the crossroads between Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, and the Iranian plateau, commanding mountain passes, river valleys, and trade routes that empires would kill to control. And many did. The Urartians were not a primitive people stumbling through history. They were engineers of remarkable sophistication. They carved fortresses directly into volcanic rock at elevations that challenged even modern construction. Their irrigation networks, channels cut through solid stone to redirect mountain water across arid terrain, still exist in fragments today, some of them still functional after 2,500 years. The citadel of Tushpa, their capital on the eastern shore of Lake Van, rose from the cliffs like something grown rather than built. It was a seat of genuine power, administrative complexity, and cultural ambition. And yet, Urartu remains one of the ancient world's most poorly understood civilizations. Part of the problem is the written record. The Urartians left inscriptions, cuneiform carved into stone, dedicatory texts to their chief deity Haldi, records of military campaigns and construction projects. But these texts are formal, ceremonial, almost deliberately impersonal. They tell us what kings built and whom they defeated. They tell us almost nothing about how ordinary people lived, what they believed privately, or how their society actually functioned day to day. It is the record of a state, not a people. Their neighbors wrote about them too, most notably the Assyrians, who clashed with Urartu repeatedly across generations of conflict. But the Assyrian accounts are, predictably, the accounts of an enemy. Victories are amplified. Urartian defeats are narrated with obvious satisfaction. Reading Assyrian records about Urartu is a little like reconstructing a civilization entirely from its rivals' press releases. What we are left with, then, is architecture and silence. And the architecture raises questions that the silence cannot answer. The scale of Urartian construction, the sheer volume of stone moved, tunneled, and shaped at altitude, has led some researchers to ask whether their labor and organizational systems were more advanced than currently credited. How were tens of thousands of workers coordinated across a mountainous, fragmented kingdom without the administrative infrastructure we typically associate with large-scale ancient construction? Some suggest we simply haven't found the evidence yet. Others argue the evidence may have existed in perishable form. Wooden records, textile archives, oral traditions. And was lost when the kingdom fell. And the fall itself is another unresolved chapter. Around 590 BC, Urartu effectively disappears from the record. The Scythians had been pressing from the north, the Medes from the east. Whether the kingdom collapsed under military pressure, internal fracture, or some combination we haven't fully mapped, historians still disagree. No single decisive event has been identified. No final battle, no documented surrender. It ended the way it began, quietly, in the mountains, without a clear announcement. What remains buried beneath the volcanic soil of that high plateau, beneath fortresses not yet fully excavated, beneath lake sediment and centuries of accumulation? no one can say with certainty. And perhaps that uncertainty is the most honest thing we can offer, before moving to the next mystery. If you love deep dives into mysteries like this, I put together an entire ebook dedicated to the hidden secrets of ancient Egypt. The Egypt they don't cover in school, don't show in museums, and don't explain in mainstream documentaries. The link is right below this video. Now, let's get into the next mystery. Not all lost history is buried in mountain soil or carved into volcanic rock. Some of it happened in rooms that still exist, in buildings you could visit today, walk through, run your hand along the stone walls of, and yet what occurred inside them remains only partially understood. We move now from the highlands of ancient Anatolia to the heart of medieval England, from silence preserved in stone to silence preserved in something stranger, in the almost complete absence of explanation for an event that killed hundreds of people in a matter of weeks. Oxford, 1577. The city in that era was a place of considerable importance, a seat of learning, a hub of legal administration, and a deeply stratified community where scholars, townspeople, clergy, and prisoners existed in uneasy proximity. The castle, built originally by the Normans, still dominated the western edge of the city. Its walls held not just administrative offices, but a jail, a place where men awaited trial, sometimes for months, in conditions that required little imagination to understand as brutal. In the summer of that year, the Oxford Assizes were convened. These were the periodic courts through which the Crown administered justice across the counties of England, judges arriving on circuit, cases heard, sentences delivered. Routine in theory, the machinery of order doing what it was designed to do. What happened instead became one of the most debated epidemiological and historical events of Tudor England. During the proceedings, something invisible moved through the courtroom. Within days, people began to die. Not prisoners, not the poorest attendants. The deaths climbed through the room with what contemporaries described as terrifying indifference to rank or station. By the time the outbreak had run its course, the toll included the Lord Chief Baron of the Exchequer, a sheriff, several knights, almost the entire jury, and somewhere between 300 and 500 additional people. Depending on which account you read, and accounts do vary considerably. The judges who presided over the assizes died. The people who had come simply to observe died. Men who had no connection to the prisoners, no reason to be vulnerable, died in numbers that made the event impossible to quietly absorb. It became known as the Black Assize of Oxford. The mainstream explanation, developed over subsequent centuries, points to typhus. Jail fever, as it was then called, a disease thriving in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of Tudor prisons, carried by lice, capable of spreading rapidly in enclosed spaces. By this account, the prisoners brought the disease into the courtroom, and the confined, poorly ventilated space did the rest. It is a plausible mechanism. Typhus was devastatingly real in this period. The connection between prison conditions and epidemic disease was something contemporaries understood dimly, even if they lacked the vocabulary of germ theory to describe it precisely. And yet the pattern of deaths gives some researchers pause. Typhus, for all its lethality, does not typically kill with the speed and selectivity described in contemporary accounts of the Black Assize. The documented deaths occurred with a concentration, both in timing and in the specific population of courtroom attendees, that some historians find difficult to reconcile entirely with a standard typhus outbreak. The mortality rate among those present was extraordinarily high. People at some distance from the courtroom, with relatively brief exposure, still died. Some accounts from the period describe a cloud, a mist, or an odor rising from documents or from the prisoners themselves at the moment of arraignment. These descriptions were taken literally by some contemporaries, evidence in a pre-scientific worldview of divine punishment or malevolent agency. Later readers dismissed them as superstition or metaphor, but a small number of modern researchers have looked at these accounts and asked a different kind of question. Could there have been a secondary or contributing factor that accelerated the lethality of whatever pathogen was present? Some have pointed to the possibility of a more virulent strain, or a combination of pathogens. typhus compounded by something else present in the prison environment, perhaps in the documents or materials handled during proceedings. Others have noted that the jail had been unusually overcrowded in the months prior, which may have produced conditions capable of incubating something beyond typical jail fever. None of these theories have been confirmed. The primary sources are limited, filtered through the assumptions of their time, and inconsistent in their details. The numbers shift between accounts. The timeline blurs. What makes the Black Assize particularly haunting, beyond the scale of death, is the social dimension. The people who died were not the forgotten. They were not the nameless poor whose passing history routinely failed to record. They were judges, landowners, officials, people whose deaths generated documentation, correspondence, grief expressed in writing. And yet, even with that paper trail, the event remains genuinely unclear. We know it happened. We know approximately how many died. We do not know with any confidence precisely what killed them at that speed, in that configuration, with that particular reach. There was a prisoner at the center of the proceedings, a man named Roland Jenks, a bookseller accused of uttering seditious words. He survived. He was convicted, sentenced to have his ears cut off, and by most accounts went on living for years afterward. The man at the origin point of the event, the one whose trial convened the room that became a killing ground, walked away. Whether that fact means anything, no one can say. But it sits there, quietly, in the record. An open door at the end of a corridor that history has never fully lit. There is something particular about events that history cannot quite bring itself to explain cleanly. The Black Assize left a courtroom full of the powerful dead and a bookseller walking free. What follows is stranger still, not because the people involved were powerful, but precisely because they were not. They were, by most accounts, children. France and Germany, 1212. Europe in the early 13th century was a continent organized around faith in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from a modern distance. The Crusades had been grinding on for over a century, costly, bloody, and increasingly inconclusive. Jerusalem had been lost to Saladin in 1187. Subsequent campaigns to reclaim it had faltered. The appetite of kings and nobles for another major expedition was complicated by politics, debt, and exhaustion. And then, from somewhere in the French countryside, a boy appeared. His name, according to the sources, was Stephen of Cloyes. He was described as a shepherd, perhaps 12 years old, who claimed to carry a letter from Christ himself, a divine commission to lead a new crusade to the Holy Land. Not an army of knights, not a campaign financed by crowns and nobility, a movement of the poor, the young, the dispossessed. People, the story goes, whom God had chosen precisely because they were without power or pretension. He preached, and people followed. Accounts of the numbers vary wildly, from a few thousand to 30,000, depending on the source and how much credibility you extend to chronicles written decades after the fact. What seems consistent is that a significant procession of young people, many of them genuinely adolescent or younger, gathered and began moving south through France toward Marseille, where Stephen reportedly believed the sea would part for them, as it had for Moses, allowing them to walk to the Holy Land. The sea did not part. Several ships were eventually offered by merchants. Two men named Hugh Phareus and William Porcus appear in the sources, and some of the children boarded. What happened next depends entirely on which account you trust. One of the most widely repeated versions claims the ships were taken not to Palestine, but to North Africa, where the passengers were sold into slavery. Two of the vessels reportedly sank in a storm near Sardinia. Whether any of this is true, whether these specific ships existed, whether the children aboard them ever reached any shore at all, is genuinely unresolved. Simultaneously, in Germany, a separate but parallel movement was unfolding. A young man named Nicholas of Cologne was leading his own procession southward toward the Alps and then Italy, with the apparent goal of reaching the Mediterranean and sailing east. Thousands are said to have joined him. The crossing of the Alps in summer claimed lives, to heat, exhaustion, hunger. Many turned back. Those who reached the Italian coast found no ships waiting, no miraculous parting of waters, no obvious path forward. They dispersed. Some reportedly made it to Rome, where Pope Innocent III received them with a mixture of sympathy and practical dismissal, praising their zeal, releasing them from their vows, and sending them home. Many never made it home. Here is where the historical record becomes genuinely difficult to read. The primary sources for the Children's Crusade are sparse, often contradictory, and were almost all written after the fact by chroniclers who were not present. Some historians have questioned whether the movement was as large as described, or whether the participants were primarily children in the modern sense, arguing that the medieval Latin term pueri could refer more broadly to the poor, the landless, or the socially marginal, regardless of age. By this reading, what history has remembered as a children's crusade may have been something closer to a peasant movement, its composition distorted by later retelling. Others push back on that interpretation, arguing that the sources are consistent enough in their descriptions of youth and naivety to suggest the traditional picture is broadly accurate, that these were, in fact, largely young people driven by genuine religious conviction into a journey for which they were entirely unprepared. And then there is a theory that sits further from the mainstream, but which refuses to disappear entirely from the literature. Some researchers have suggested a connection between the Children's Crusade and the later legend of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, a story of a town's children following a stranger and vanishing, preserved in German folklore and eventually recorded in the 13th and 14th centuries. The geographic overlap, the timing, the central image of children following a charismatic figure into an unknown fate. These parallels have led a small number of scholars to speculate that the legend may carry a distorted memory of an actual event. Not a fairy tale invented from nothing, but a cultural echo of something that genuinely happened and was too painful or too strange to remember clearly. No direct evidence links the two. The theory remains speculative, but it is the kind of speculation that, once encountered, is difficult to set aside. What we are left with is a movement, real enough to appear in multiple independent sources across two countries, that gathered thousands of people, many of them young, pointed them toward a distant Holy Land, and then released them into a journey from which a significant number never returned. No one organized a recovery. No inquiry was launched. No memorial was built. History simply moved on. Somewhere between the chronicles that recorded it and the silence that followed, the full shape of what actually happened, who these children were, where they came from, what they believed, and what ultimately became of them, dissolved quietly into the past. And the question that lingers is not just what happened to them. It is why, for so long, no one thought that question worth answering. History has a habit of losing the people who had no power to record themselves. The children who followed Stephen of Cloyes southward through France left almost no trace of their own voices, only the observations of others, filtered through time and assumption. What follows is different in one important way. This time the event was documented as it happened. Officials wrote about it. Physicians were summoned. Decisions were made in real time. And still, no one could explain it. Strasbourg, July 1518. The city sat along the Rhine in the Alsace region, prosperous by the standards of the era, but under considerable stress. The years preceding 1518 had brought famine, disease, and the kind of grinding economic hardship that settled into communities like a slow weather system, reshaping daily life in ways that rarely made it into formal records but were felt in every household. People were tired. People were afraid. The social fabric was pulled tight in the particular way it gets when ordinary life becomes quietly unbearable. It began with a single woman. Her name was Frau Trophea. On a street in Strasbourg sometime in mid-July, she began to dance. There was no music. There was no celebration. She simply danced, compulsively, continuously, without apparent ability or desire to stop. By the end of the first day, she was still dancing. By the end of the first week, she had not meaningfully stopped. Within a month, she had been joined by somewhere between 50 and 400 people, depending on the source. They danced in the streets, in public squares, in the spaces between buildings. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Some reportedly suffered heart failures. Contemporary accounts suggest that, at the height of the episode, people were dying at a rate of several per day. Not from violence, not from disease in any recognizable form, but from the physical consequences of dancing without rest. The city authorities, to their credit, did not simply ignore it. They consulted physicians. They deliberated. And then they made a decision that, to a modern reader, seems almost incomprehensible. They concluded that the cure for the dancing was more dancing. They hired musicians. They cleared a guild hall and a grain market to provide space. They brought in professional dancers, apparently on the theory that allowing the afflicted to dance themselves to exhaustion in a controlled environment would eventually break the episode. It did not immediately break. The dancing continued into September. And then, as quietly as it had begun, it stopped. The physicians who examined the dancers during the outbreak rejected supernatural explanations, at least formally, and attributed the condition to overheated blood, a diagnosis consistent with the medical frameworks of the time. The recommended treatment of continued dancing followed from this logic, however counterintuitive it appears now. Some officials considered the possibility of demonic possession, but were apparently persuaded toward the medical interpretation. The question of what actually caused the dancing plague of 1518 has never been definitively resolved. The most widely accepted modern explanation centers on mass psychogenic illness, a phenomenon in which psychological stress, operating within a community that shares certain cultural and religious beliefs, produces genuine physical symptoms that spread from person to person without any pathogen involved. The mechanism is real and documented in other contexts across history and into the present. Communities under extreme stress, particularly those with shared frameworks for interpreting unusual experiences, can generate episodes of collective physical response that defy straightforward medical categorization. By this reading, Frau Trophäa's dancing was the first expression of something that had been building in Strasbourg for years: hunger, fear, grief. And once it began, the cultural context of the city provided a template through which others could unconsciously follow. The body, under sufficient psychological pressure, can do things the conscious mind would never choose. It is a compelling explanation. But it leaves certain details unaccounted for. The sheer duration of the episode, weeks, not hours, and the physical consequences, including apparent fatalities, push against the boundaries of what documented cases of mass psychogenic illness typically produce. Most such episodes resolve relatively quickly once the triggering conditions are addressed or the affected individuals are separated. Strasbourg's episode persisted and expanded even after authorities intervened directly. A secondary theory involves ergotism, poisoning from a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, capable of producing convulsions, hallucinations, and involuntary muscle movements. Ergot poisoning was not uncommon in medieval and early modern Europe, and Strasbourg's recent famines may have increased consumption of contaminated grain. Some researchers have proposed that ergotism could have contributed to or amplified the episode, potentially producing the physical symptoms that made the dancing uncontrollable rather than merely compulsive. Others have noted that the specific form the episode took, dancing rather than any other physical expression, may itself be significant. Strasbourg had a tradition of associating uncontrollable dancing with the curse of Saint Vitus, a martyred Christian saint believed to afflict those who offended him with compulsive movement. The cultural script, in other words, may have shaped the symptom. The community already had a name for this, already had a story into which the experience could be poured. Whether that story created the dancing, or simply described it, is a question that research has not cleanly resolved. What remains is the image itself. A woman dancing alone in a Strasbourg street in the summer of 1518, unable to stop for reasons she may not have understood herself. Joined day by others equally unable to explain what was happening to their own bodies. A city watching, documenting, deliberating, and ultimately as bewildered as anyone. The records exist. The event happened. The explanation even now remains just slightly out of reach. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thing about it. Not that it occurred in a distant superstitious age, but that we have looked at it carefully, with everything we know, and still cannot say with certainty what it was. The Dancing Plague of 1518 left Strasbourg with documents, with names, with a record precise enough to argue over. What follows leaves us with something considerably thinner, a civilization of genuine scale and consequence that somehow slipped through the archive almost entirely, known more through the accounts of its neighbors than through anything it left behind itself. There is a region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea where the land flattens into an enormous steppe, broken by river deltas and reed beds and the occasional low ridge of hills running toward a horizon that seems to recede as you approach it. It is not, at first glance, the kind of landscape that suggests empire. There is no natural fortress here, no obvious geographic logic for a capital, no single commanding height from which power announces itself. And yet, for roughly 3 centuries, from around 650 AD to 965 AD, this region was the seat of one of the most strategically important states in the medieval world, the Khazars. They emerged from the western Eurasian steppe as part of the broader Turkic migrations that reshaped the post-Roman world. By the mid-7th century, they had consolidated enough territory and military capacity to become a genuine regional power, controlling the corridor between the Caucasus Mountains and the Caspian, a geographic choke point through which armies, merchants, and ideas had to pass if they were moving between the Middle East and the northern forests of what would become Russia. This position made them indispensable. When the early Islamic caliphates expanded northward through Persia and into the Caucasus, in the 7th and 8th centuries, it was the Khazars who stopped them. The Arab-Khazar Wars, fought across several decades of brutal campaigning, ended not in Arab conquest, but in a kind of exhausted stalemate. The Khazar frontier held. Some historians have argued, without great exaggeration, that this resistance altered the trajectory of European history, that without the Khazar buffer, the Islamic expansion of the 7th and 8th centuries might have continued northward into the Eurasian steppe and beyond, reaching peoples and places that instead developed along entirely different lines. The Khazars, in other words, may have shaped medieval Europe without Europe ever fully registering that they existed. Their capital, Idil, sat near the mouth of the Volga, where it emptied into the Caspian. By the accounts of Arab and Byzantine travelers who visited or wrote about it, Idil was a substantial city, a trading hub where merchants from the Islamic world, from Byzantium, from the Rus principalities to the north, and from the steppe peoples to the east, all converged. It had markets, administrative quarters, a seasonal rhythm tied to the movement of the Khagan, the supreme ruler, between winter and summer residences. No one has found it. Despite considerable archaeological effort, the physical location of Idil remains unconfirmed. The Volga Delta has shifted over centuries. Flooding, erosion, and the sheer passage of time have obscured whatever remains exist. Some candidates have been proposed, some excavations conducted, but nothing has been definitively identified as the capital of a state that, by all written accounts, was genuinely metropolitan. A civilization that hosted international trade, fielded armies capable of stopping the Arab Caliphate, and maintained diplomatic correspondence with both Byzantium and the early Islamic world. And its capital cannot be found. Then there is the conversion. Sometime in the 8th or 9th century, the precise date is debated, and may be unanswerable, the Khazar ruling class converted to Judaism, not to Christianity, which Byzantium actively promoted among neighboring peoples, not to Islam, which the Arab world pressed upon everyone within its reach, to Judaism, which had no imperial sponsor, no missionary infrastructure, no political power offering advantages in exchange for adoption of the faith. The sources that describe this conversion, most notably a correspondence between a Khazar king and a Jewish dignitary in Moorish Spain, known as the Khazar Correspondence, present it as a deliberate, reasoned choice. The Khagan, according to the account, invited representatives of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism to make their cases, and chose Judaism. Whether this account is literally accurate, embellished, or substantially invented is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. The correspondence itself has been questioned, its authenticity disputed, its details examined for anachronism and inconsistency. But the conversion, in some form, appears to be real. Too many independent sources reference a Judaized Khazar ruling class for the detail to be pure invention. What it meant in practice, how deeply the conversion penetrated beyond the elite, how it affected the ordinary population of a multi-ethnic steppe empire, what Jewish practice looked like in this specific context, is almost entirely unknown. And then the empire ended. In 965 AD, the Rus prince Sviatoslav swept down from the north and broke the Khazar military capacity in a campaign that appears, from the outside, almost shockingly swift. Ital fell. The administrative structure collapsed. Within a generation, the Khazars had ceased to function as a coherent political entity. What happened to the population is one of history's quieter, open questions. Some were absorbed into neighboring cultures. Some may have migrated westward into Eastern Europe. A theory, contested, politically charged, and impossible to verify with current evidence, suggests that Khazar Jewish communities contributed to the formation of Ashkenazi Jewish populations in medieval Europe. Most geneticists and historians treat this claim with considerable skepticism, pointing to other more documented routes of Jewish migration. But it persists in the literature, surfacing and receding without ever being fully closed. The Khazars built something real. They held a frontier that mattered. They made a religious choice that had no obvious political logic. And then they vanished into a landscape that has since swallowed even their cities. What remains buried beneath the shifting sediment of the Volga Delta? What letters? What objects? What evidence of an entire civilization's inner life? Is a question that archaeology has not yet answered, and may not answer for a very long time. The Khazars disappeared into silence. Their capital unlocated, their inner life unrecorded, their fate absorbed into the movements of other peoples and other histories. It is the kind of disappearance that happens gradually, over generations, the edges of a civilization softening until there is nothing left to hold the shape. What follows is different. What follows is not a slow dissolution, but a sudden, global dimming. An event so large it touched every inhabited continent simultaneously, and yet so poorly understood that historians spent centuries arguing about whether it had happened at all. Imagine standing outside on a clear morning, sometime in the early months of 536 AD, anywhere in the northern hemisphere. The sun has risen. You can see it. A pale disk, wan and distant, as though viewed through frosted glass. The light it casts is wrong. Shadows are soft where they should be sharp. The warmth that should follow sunrise does not arrive. By midday, the sky carries a strange, persistent haze. Not cloud, not fog, but something thinner and more total, a veil drawn across the atmosphere that does not move with the wind and does not lift with the hours. It stayed like that for 18 months. Contemporary accounts from across the known world describe the same phenomenon in different languages and different metaphors, but with a consistency that is itself remarkable. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave light without brightness, resembling the moon. Cassiodorus, a Roman official serving in Italy, recorded that the seasons seemed to have merged, that it was impossible to tell summer from autumn by the quality of the light. In China, official records noted persistent dry fog, diminished sunlight, and catastrophic crop failures. In Peru, ice cores drilled from glaciers centuries later would preserve a chemical record of the same event, layered into the ice like a scar. The sun, for a year and a half, was effectively switched off. The consequences were not metaphorical. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped sharply. Some estimates suggest by as much as 2 degrees Celsius on average, which sounds modest until you consider what 2 degrees means at the scale of agriculture across an entire civilization. Summer temperatures in Europe fell low enough to prevent grain from maturing. Harvests failed. Not in one region, not in one country, but across the connected world simultaneously. The famine that followed was widespread and severe, documented in sources from Ireland to Mesopotamia to China. And famine, historically, is rarely alone. The years following 536 brought what some researchers now describe as a cascade, a sequence of compounding catastrophes in which each failure created the conditions for the next. Weakened populations, malnourished and displaced, were less able to resist disease. In 541 AD, the first great outbreak of bubonic plague in recorded history, the Plague of Justinian, swept through the Byzantine Empire and beyond, killing tens of millions of people over the following 2 centuries. Whether the plague was a direct consequence of the events of 536 cannot be stated with certainty, but the timing has not escaped researchers. A world already destabilized by years of crop failure and famine was a world uniquely vulnerable to pandemic. The bodies were already compromised, the social structures were already strained. For a long time, the cause of the 536 event was debated with considerable heat and insufficient evidence. Volcanic eruption was the primary candidate. A sufficiently large eruption can inject enough sulfur dioxide and ash into the upper atmosphere to scatter incoming solar radiation for years. The ice cores seemed to confirm volcanic activity in the relevant period. But which volcano? Where? In 2018, analysis of ice cores from a glacier in Switzerland identified microscopic shards of volcanic glass, tephra, that pointed toward a massive eruption in Iceland, likely from a volcano in the region now associated with the Elja system. Further investigation suggested this was not a single event, but the opening episode of a sequence. A second major eruption in 540 AD, and a third in 547 AD, creating a decade and a half of repeated atmospheric disruption that compounded each time the world had barely begun to recover from the last. This explanation is now broadly accepted among climate scientists and historians. The volcanic hypothesis fits the physical evidence, and yet certain aspects of the event still resist clean resolution. The scale of the human response, or more precisely, the near absence of organized response, raises questions about the administrative capacity of the states that existed in 536. The Byzantine Empire, the most sophisticated governmental structure in the Western world at that moment, was unable to meaningfully mitigate the famine or coordinate relief across affected regions. The event exposed, in a way that no political crisis had, the absolute dependency of every human civilization on a stable climate, a dependency so fundamental that no one had thought to plan for its disruption. There is also the question of memory. An event this large, this global, this devastating in its human consequences. Did it leave a trace in the mythologies and folk memories of the peoples who lived through it? Some researchers have suggested that stories of a great darkness, a fading sun, a time when the world grew cold and harvests failed, recurring across cultures that had no contact with each other, may carry distorted echoes of 536 and the years that followed. The Norse concept of Fimbulwinter, the great winter that precedes the end of the world, has been proposed as one such echo. The suggestion is speculative. It cannot be proven. But it returns us to a question that runs beneath all of these stories. How much of what we call myth is memory? How much of what we have filed under legend and superstition was once a real experience, lived by real people, that survived only by changing its shape, becoming story because the original event was too large, too disorienting, too far outside the boundaries of the explainable to be passed down as simple fact? The year 536 happened. The sun dimmed. The harvests failed. The people endured it or did not. What they made of it in the long dark of that 18-month twilight, we can only guess at. The year 536 reshaped the world slowly through cold and hunger and the quiet arithmetic of failed harvests. It was a catastrophe without a face, atmospheric, impersonal, indifferent to borders or allegiances. What follows is smaller in scale, but no less strange, and it has something the dimming of the sun did not: a cast of specific people, specific decisions, and a sequence of events that should be straightforward to understand, and yet is not. Constantinople, January 530 D. The city was, by any measure, the most sophisticated urban environment in the Western world at that moment. 500,000 people lived within its walls. Its harbors handled the commercial traffic of 3 continents. Its administrative apparatus governed an empire stretching from the Balkans to the edge of Mesopotamia. At its center sat the Hippodrome, not merely a stadium, but the primary public space where the population of Constantinople and the emperor met, where political sentiment was expressed, where the distance between throne and city was either maintained or collapsed, depending on the mood of any given afternoon. The emperor was Justinian. He had been on the throne for 5 years. He was intelligent, tireless, and by the accounts of people who knew him, genuinely difficult to like. His wife, Theodora, was by most assessments more politically astute than he was, and the sources that survive, most of them hostile, cannot quite decide whether to be more appalled by her influence or her origins. The Hippodrome was divided, as it had been for generations, into factions. The Blues and the Greens, nominally chariot racing supporters, but functioning in practice as something closer to organized political constituencies, with their own leadership structures, their own patronage networks, and their own capacity for coordinated action. The Blues and the Greens hated each other with the sustained, ritualized intensity that only institutions can sustain over generations. In January 532, they stopped hating each other. The immediate trigger was specific: Justinian's refusal to pardon members of both factions who had been condemned to death following street violence. The pardons were expected. The refusal was not. In the Hippodrome, the chants that began as the usual partisan noise shifted into something unprecedented. The Blues and the Greens began chanting together. The word they settled on was Nika, Greek for conquer or victory. It became the name of what followed. The Nika Revolt lasted 5 days. In those 5 days, roughly half of Constantinople burned. The rioters moved through the city with a fury that contemporary accounts describe as organized enough to suggest prior coordination, yet chaotic enough to suggest genuine mass grievance. Government buildings were torched. The original Hagia Sophia, not the structure that stands today but its predecessor, was destroyed. The prison was opened. The streets became impassable. Justinian, by at least one account, was sufficiently terrified to consider flight, to board a ship and abandon the city entirely. Theodora, according to Procopius, told him that the purple of empire made a fine burial shroud, and that she would not flee. He stayed. What happened next was the work of 2 generals, Belisarius and Mundus, and it was not a negotiation. The rioters, by this point, had coalesced around a figure named Hypatius, the nephew of a former emperor, who had been proclaimed emperor by the crowd in the Hippodrome with what appears to have been genuine reluctance on his part. Whether Hypatius wanted the throne or simply could not escape the role the mob assigned him is one of the questions the sources do not cleanly resolve. The generals sealed the Hippodrome. Their soldiers entered and killed those inside. The death toll recorded in contemporary sources ranges between 30,000 and 35,000 people. Numbers so large they strain credibility, and yet no source seriously contests that the massacre was catastrophic. Hypatius was captured, briefly received by Justinian, and executed the following day, along with his brother. The revolt was over. The city began slowly to bury its dead. What makes the Nika Revolt genuinely difficult to interpret is the question of what it actually was. The surface reading is a tax revolt, or a factional uprising, or a crisis of confidence in an unpopular administration that briefly escalated beyond anyone's control. These explanations are not wrong exactly. The grievances were real. Justinian's tax policies were extractive, his chief minister John the Cappadocian was widely despised, and the decision to deny the pardons was a miscalculation of significant proportions. But the speed with which the Blues and the Greens unified, factions that had defined themselves through mutual hostility for generations, suggests something more deliberate operating beneath the surface. Some historians have proposed that the revolt was not entirely spontaneous, that aristocratic families with dynastic grievances against Justinian used the factional unrest as cover for a more calculated attempt to replace him with Hypatius. By this reading, what looked like a popular uprising was at least partly a managed coup that got out of hand. The evidence for this is suggestive but not conclusive. The sources are primarily Procopius, whose relationship with the truth was situational at best, and whose account of these events serves particular narrative purposes that make it difficult to read as straightforward reportage. Hypatius himself remains the most opaque figure in the story. A man who was reportedly dragged from his home by the crowd, forced into imperial purple against his will, and then executed for a throne he may never have sought. Or a willing conspirator whose performance of reluctance was exactly that, a performance, and whose guilt was clear enough to warrant immediate execution. Justinian did not leave an explanation for why Hypatius had to die so quickly, before any formal process, before any record of what he knew or who had supported him could be established. That absence is its own kind of answer. Or perhaps it is simply the silence that power leaves behind when it moves too fast for the record to follow. The same silence that runs, in one form or another, through everything we have explored tonight. The Hippodrome still exists, in outline, beneath the surface of modern Istanbul. The stones are there. The shape of the space persists. What was said in it, in those final hours before the doors were sealed, no one recorded. Justinian sealed the Hippodrome, and the record went quiet. 30,000 people died in an afternoon, and the man responsible left no explanation, only the silence that follows when power moves faster than accountability. It is a particular kind of erasure, deliberate and immediate, the archive edited in real time. But there is another kind of forgetting, slower, larger, so total that the people on the other side of it had no memory of what had been lost, no sense of absence, no awareness that something was missing, because the very framework for recognizing the loss had disappeared along with everything else. This is what some researchers now call the Greek Dark Ages. Others have begun using a different phrase, quieter and more precise. The Great Forgetting. The Greek world of the Late Bronze Age, roughly 1600 to 1200 BC, was not the Greece most people picture when they think of ancient civilization. It was not the Greece of philosophers and city-states and democratic assemblies. It was something older and in many respects more elaborate. The Mycenaean civilization centered on palace complexes at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and elsewhere across the Greek mainland and islands, maintained a level of administrative sophistication, long-distance trade, and architectural ambition that would not be matched again in the region for centuries. They had a writing system. Linear B, a syllabic script used primarily for administrative record-keeping, tracking livestock, grain, textiles, personnel, and the movements of goods across a palace economy. They maintained diplomatic contact with Egypt, with the Hittite Empire, with the trading networks of the Eastern Mediterranean. Their palaces had drainage systems, frescoed walls, and storage facilities capable of managing the economic output of entire regions. And then, between approximately 1200 and 1150 BC, almost all of it ended. The palaces burned, Linear B disappeared, not declined, not evolved into something else, but vanished so completely that when writing re-emerged in Greece several centuries later, it was an entirely different system borrowed from the Phoenicians, with no apparent continuity from what had come before. Trade networks collapsed, population levels dropped sharply, the elaborate palace economies ceased to function, the archaeological record, dense and complex in the centuries before, becomes thin and quiet. For roughly 400 years, the Greek world left almost no written record at all. This is the anomaly at the heart of the Great Forgetting, not simply that a civilization declined, but that it declined so completely and in so many dimensions simultaneously that the people who came after had no living memory of what their predecessors had achieved. Homer's epics, composed centuries after the collapse, preserved garbled memories of a heroic age of great palaces and bronze-armed kings, but preserved them as myth, as legend, as material whose historical basis even the Greeks themselves could not confidently assess. The cause of the Bronze Age collapse, the broader catastrophe of which the Mycenaean decline was one part, is one of the most contested questions in ancient history. The conventional explanation for many decades pointed to the Sea Peoples, a confederation of migrating groups, origin unclear, who appear in Egyptian records of the period as invaders pressing against the empire's borders. The Egyptians managed to repel them, but others did not. The Hittite Empire collapsed around the same time as Mycenae. Urartu, the great trading city on the Syrian coast, was destroyed and never rebuilt. A letter found at Urartu, apparently written in the final days before the city fell, describes ships and enemies and a crisis unfolding faster than the city could respond. It was never sent. The Sea Peoples theory has since been complicated considerably. Many researchers now argue that they were a symptom of the collapse as much as a cause. Displaced populations themselves, set in motion by prior disruptions, arriving in a world already destabilized rather than destabilizing a world that had been stable. What destabilized it then? Climate data extracted from ancient pollen samples and isotope analysis suggests a prolonged drought across the eastern Mediterranean beginning around 1200 BC. Decades of reduced rainfall that would have stressed agricultural systems already operating near their capacity. Systems as complex and interdependent as the late Bronze Age palace economies are, paradoxically, fragile in proportion to their sophistication. A disruption in one node propagates through the network. Grain shortfalls in one region affect trade in another. Administrative systems built to manage surplus have no protocol for sustained deficit. Some researchers have added earthquake sequences to the picture, geological evidence of significant seismic activity in the relevant period across the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean. Others have pointed to internal rebellions, to the possibility that the palace economies, extractive and hierarchical, generated their own opposition that the disruptions of drought and migration made impossible to contain. The emerging consensus is that the Bronze Age collapse was not caused by any single factor, but by the simultaneous failure of multiple interlocking systems: climate, trade, agriculture, administration, in a sequence that no individual palace or kingdom had the resources to survive alone. But consensus is not the same as understanding, because what remains most difficult to account for is not the physical destruction. Palaces burn, populations move, economies contract. These things happen throughout history without producing 4 centuries of near-total cultural amnesia. What produced the forgetting was something beyond the material collapse, a rupture in the transmission of knowledge so complete that the survivors, and their children, and their children's children, lost not just the content of what had been known, but the very systems, writing, administration, trade, through which knowledge had been preserved and passed forward. They did not know what they had lost. They had no word for it. The absence had no shape. And when the Greeks eventually re-emerged into literacy and complexity, they looked back at the age before the silence and saw only giants. Heroes of impossible strength, builders of walls too massive for ordinary men, inhabitants of a world more vivid and more real than anything the present could offer. They called it the Age of Heroes because they had no other name for it. What it actually was, how it was actually lived, what its people thought and feared and hoped for, fell into a silence so deep that, even now, with all the tools available to modern archaeology, we are only beginning to hear the faintest echo of it. And the question that remains is whether there are other silences like it, earlier, deeper, further back, that we have not yet learned to listen for. The Great Forgetting was total in a way that no single decision could produce. It required the collapse of every system through which knowledge travels: writing, trade, administration, memory itself. 4 centuries of near silence, and the people on the other side of it had no framework for understanding what had been lost. But there is another kind of erasure that does not require catastrophe. It does not need drought or invasion, or the burning of palaces. It operates quietly, consistently, across every civilization we have examined tonight, and almost everyone we have not. It does not announce itself. It simply makes certain lives invisible, not by accident, not through neglect, but through the steady application of a preference so deeply embedded in the archive that it became, for most of recorded history, indistinguishable from the natural order of things. The erasure of women from the historical record. This is not a simple story. It is not a story with clean villains or a single mechanism. It is something more pervasive and more interesting than that. A pattern running through the archive like a watermark, visible only when you hold the document up to the right kind of light. Begin with the physical record itself. In cultures across the ancient world, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, the people who wrote things down were, with rare exceptions, men. The people who commissioned monuments, dedicated inscriptions, and funded the preservation of texts were, with rare exceptions, men. The administrative systems that generated the documents historians rely on, tax records, legal proceedings, military rosters, commercial contracts, were designed to track the activities of men because men were, legally and economically, the primary actors those systems were built to manage. Women appear in these records most commonly in relation to men, as wives, daughters, mothers, as property transferred in marriage contracts, as the subject of legal disputes involving male guardians, the texture of their daily lives, their thoughts, their relationships with each other, their expertise in labor and grief. These things were simply not what the record was designed to capture, and so they were not captured. What makes this more than a bureaucratic oversight is the evidence of what was actively suppressed. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt as pharaoh for roughly 20 years in the 15th century BC, one of the most successful reigns of the New Kingdom, marked by ambitious building projects, profitable trade expeditions, and genuine administrative stability. After her death, her successor Thutmose III, possibly her stepson, undertook a systematic campaign to remove her from the record. Her images were chiseled from temple walls, her statues were destroyed or buried, her name was excised from king lists. For 3,000 years she was so effectively erased that when archaeologists began reassembling the evidence in the 19th and 20th centuries, the scale of the deletion was itself one of the most striking findings. Someone had worked very hard to make her disappear. She is not alone. Nefertiti, whose influence during the reign of Akhenaten appears from surviving evidence to have been extraordinary, possibly co-regent, possibly ruling in her own right during a transitional period, vanishes from the record abruptly and completely. Where she went, what happened to her, whether she survived Akhenaten's death and under what name or identity, remains one of Egyptology's most genuinely unresolved questions. The absence is too complete to be accidental. Something was managed. Move forward to classical antiquity, and the pattern does not simplify. It proliferates. The women of ancient Greece are among the most thoroughly documented absences in the historical record. Athens, celebrated as the birthplace of democracy, confined its women to a legal and social status barely distinguishable from permanent minority. They could not vote, own property in most circumstances, or participate in public life. They do not appear in the historical record as individuals except in the rarest of cases. And yet the philosophical and literary record keeps betraying their presence. Socrates, in Plato's dialogues, credits a woman named Diotima of Mantinea with teaching him the theory of love that forms the centerpiece of the Symposium, one of the foundational texts of Western philosophy. Whether Diotima was a historical person or a literary device is a question scholars have not resolved. But the fact that Plato chose to place this teaching in the mouth of a woman, and that Socrates presents her as his intellectual superior in this domain, suggests at minimum that the idea of women as philosophical authorities was not entirely unthinkable, even in Athens. What was she actually saying, if she existed? What did she write, if she wrote? Nothing survives. Aspasia of Miletus, the companion of Pericles, was by multiple accounts one of the most intellectually formidable people in 5th century Athens. She is referenced in sources as a teacher of rhetoric, a political advisor, a woman whose conversation drew some of the most prominent thinkers of the age. She was tried, apparently for impiety, in a proceeding that seems, reading between the lines of surviving accounts, to have been at least partly an attack on Pericles conducted through her. Pericles wept in court on her behalf, which the sources record with evident surprise. Nothing she wrote survives. It is not clear she was permitted to write in any form that would have been preserved. The further back the record goes, the more pronounced the absence becomes. And yet, archaeology, which does not depend on the choices of ancient scribes, keeps finding evidence of women in roles the written record denied them. Female skeletons buried with weapons, suggesting warrior status. Women interred with the tools of trades the legal record reserved for men. Residue analysis on ancient vessels attributing the production of particular foods and medicines to female specialists whose expertise left no written trace. The bodies remember what the documents forgot, which raises a question that the archive, by its nature, cannot answer. How many Hatshepsuts were never powerful enough to be worth erasing? How many Aspasias lived and thought and taught in contexts too ordinary to attract even hostile documentation? How many women built, discovered, governed, and understood things that the record simply declined to notice? Not because the women were absent, but because the people doing the recording had already decided, before picking up the stylus, whose life was worth the clay. The silence in the archive is not empty. It is full of people the record chose not to see. The silence in the archive is not always the silence of neglect. Sometimes it is the silence of intention, the deliberate quiet left behind when someone with sufficient power decided that a particular voice, a particular belief, a particular way of understanding the world should not be permitted to continue. We have seen how women were written out of the record through the slow accumulation of institutional preference. What follows is faster, more violent, and more concentrated. A silence produced not over centuries but over decades by armies moving through a specific landscape with a specific mandate. The landscape is southern France, the region known historically as Languedoc. In the early 13th century, this was one of the most culturally distinctive regions in Europe. Prosperous, relatively tolerant by the standards of the age, and home to a civilization that had developed along different lines from the feudal structures of northern France. The troubadour tradition had flourished here. The nobility spoke Occitan rather than the French of the north. Jews and Christians lived in closer proximity than almost anywhere else in Western Europe, with a degree of social interaction that would have been unremarkable locally and scandalous further north. And here, more densely than anywhere else in the Christian world, lived the Cathars. The Cathars, or the Good Christians, as they called themselves, held a set of beliefs that the Catholic Church classified as heresy, but which had spread through Languedoc with a persistence suggesting they met genuine spiritual needs that official Christianity was not addressing. Their theology was dualist. They believed the material world was the creation of a malevolent force, a kind of evil demiurge, while the true God was purely spiritual. Physical existence was, by this account, a kind of imprisonment. The goal of human life was liberation from matter, not redemption within it. This was not a fringe sect whispering in corners. The Cathars had their own clergy, the perfecti, men and women who had taken strict vows of poverty, celibacy, and non-violence, and who served as the spiritual leaders of a lay community spread across dozens of towns and villages. They held public debates. They had the protection, explicit or tacit, of significant portions of the southern nobility, including the Count of Toulouse. They baptized, counseled, and buried the dead of entire communities. In 1208, Pope Innocent III called a crusade against them. This was an extraordinary step. Crusades had been directed outward, toward the Holy Land, toward Muslim-held territories on the edges of Europe. What Innocent authorized was something different. A crusade directed inward against Christians on Christian soil, in the heart of a region nominally under the authority of the French crown. The pretext was the murder of a papal legate killed on a road in Languedoc under circumstances that remained disputed. The underlying logic was the failure of every previous effort to suppress Catharism through persuasion and ecclesiastical pressure. The campaign that followed lasted, in its various phases, approximately 20 years. The northern French nobility who answered the call brought with them not just religious zeal but obvious political appetite. The lands of Languedoc were wealthy, and the Crusade offered a legal mechanism for their redistribution. The town of Béziers fell in July 1209. What happened there entered history through a single reported exchange. A papal legate, asked how crusaders should distinguish Cathar from Catholic among the town's population, allegedly replied that they should kill everyone and let God sort out his own. The town was massacred. Estimates of the dead range from 7,000 to 20,000, with the uncertainty reflecting the limits of medieval record-keeping rather than any genuine ambiguity about what occurred. Whether the legate actually said those words cannot be confirmed. The quote appears in a single source, written some years after the event. But the massacre itself is not disputed, and the quote, real or constructed, captured something true about the logic of what was happening, that the campaign had moved beyond the suppression of heresy into the elimination of an entire regional culture. Carcassonne fell shortly after Béziers. The Crusade moved through the landscape with a comprehensiveness that left entire communities destroyed or dispersed. The last significant Cathar stronghold was the mountain fortress of Montségur, which held out until 1244. When it finally fell, the perfecti who remained inside, somewhere between 200 and 220 people, were offered their lives in exchange for conversion. Almost none accepted. They walked down from the fortress and into a fire built at the base of the mountain. What the Cathars actually believed, in its full complexity, is now almost impossible to reconstruct. This is the central historical problem of the Albigensian Crusade. The texts the Cathars produced, their scriptural commentaries, their theological arguments, the records of their councils, were systematically destroyed. What survives of Cathar belief comes almost entirely from the records of the Inquisition that followed the Crusade, from interrogations conducted by people whose institutional purpose was the elimination of the movement they were documenting. Reading Cathar theology through Inquisition records is an exercise in profound epistemic difficulty. The frame distorts everything inside it. Some researchers have spent careers attempting to reconstruct Cathar thought from these compromised sources. Others argue the distortion is too severe, that what we have is not Cathar belief, but the Catholic Church's version of it, shaped by the needs of prosecution rather than the requirements of accuracy. A small number of texts that may be genuinely Cathar in origin have survived, discovered in archives and collections across Europe. They suggest a tradition more sophisticated and internally varied than the Inquisition records imply. But the corpus is too thin, too fragmentary, to support confident reconstruction. An entire theology, held by hundreds of thousands of people across a region, passed down through generations of perfecti, argued and refined and lived, reduced to ash and the records of its prosecutors. What did the Cathars actually understand about the world that the Church found so threatening it required not just refutation, but annihilation? The question cannot be answered from what survives, and perhaps that is precisely the point. The Cathars were destroyed by a decision, a deliberate, documented, institutionally sanctioned choice to eliminate not just a movement, but the memory of one. What remains of them is what their enemies chose to preserve, filtered through the requirements of prosecution and the logic of condemnation. What follows is a different kind of erasure, less deliberate in its origin, no less total in its effect. A people not targeted by theological machinery but absorbed, displaced, and gradually dissolved by the ordinary violence of colonial encounter. And yet the mystery they left behind is, in its own way, just as resistant to resolution. In the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 100 kilometers off the northwestern coast of Africa, a chain of volcanic islands rises sharply from deep water. The Canary Islands are geologically young, formed by hotspot volcanism over millions of years. Their peaks still raw enough in places to suggest the process has not entirely finished. The landscape varies dramatically between islands. Lush laurel forests in the north, black lava fields in the south, peaks high enough to hold snow while the coastline below bakes in subtropical heat. It is a place of striking contrasts, isolated enough that its native ecosystems developed in near complete separation from the continental landmasses surrounding it. And yet, when European sailors arrived in earnest in the 14th and 15th centuries, they found the islands inhabited. The people they encountered called themselves, on the largest island, the Guanches. The name has since been applied, somewhat loosely, to the indigenous populations of all the Canary Islands, though each island had its own distinct culture, language, and social organization. They were not a unified civilization in any formal sense. They were separate communities that had adapted over many centuries to the specific conditions of their individual islands. What they were doing there, how they came to be on islands in the middle of the Atlantic without boats capable of inter-island travel by the time Europeans arrived, is the first and most persistent mystery. Genetic and linguistic analysis has established with reasonable confidence that the Guanches were of Berber origin. Their closest biological and linguistic relatives were the Amazigh peoples of North Africa, particularly from the regions of modern Morocco and Algeria. At some point, likely several thousand years BC, people from the North African coast crossed the Atlantic and settled the islands. This much is broadly accepted. What is not understood is how, or precisely when, or why, and most intriguingly, why they apparently stopped. By the time Europeans arrived, the Guanches had no seaworthy boats. They fished from the shore and from small vessels unsuitable for open ocean navigation. They had no apparent knowledge of or contact with the other islands in the chain, let alone with the African continent from which their ancestors had come. A people descended from seafarers capable of crossing open Atlantic water had become, over the intervening centuries, entirely land-bound. This is genuinely strange. Island peoples across the Pacific maintained and developed maritime traditions over comparable timescales. The Guanches, by contrast, appear to have lost theirs, or never fully developed them in the first place, depending on how you read the evidence. Some researchers have suggested the original crossing may not have been intentional, that the ancestors of the Guanches arrived by accident, carried by current and wind, and simply had no way to recreate the journey. Others argue the crossing was deliberate, but that the specific conditions of the Canary Islands, favorable for settlement, lacking the incentive structure that drives maritime expansion elsewhere, simply removed the pressure to maintain oceanic capability. Neither explanation is fully satisfying. What the Guanches built in their isolation is remarkable in its own right. They developed sophisticated systems of mummification, a practice found independently in very few cultures worldwide, preserving their dead through a combination of evisceration, desiccation, and the application of specific plant materials. The technique was sufficiently advanced that Guanche mummies recovered in the 19th and 20th centuries have allowed detailed biological and dietary analysis. Their mummification practice was not identical to Egyptian methods, but the structural similarities were striking enough to fuel, for a period, speculative theories about transatlantic contact between ancient Egypt and the Canary Islands. Most researchers treat these theories with considerable skepticism, but the parallel remains unexplained. Two geographically distant cultures independently arriving at complex mummification practices, using broadly similar logic, separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. Their social organization varied by island, but shared certain features: a warrior aristocracy, a priestly or shamanic class, communal land management, and a series of oral traditions that European observers recorded imperfectly and often with obvious incomprehension. They built stone structures, including circular dwelling complexes and ceremonial enclosures, some of which survive in partial form. On Gran Canaria, a series of cave complexes were carved into volcanic tuff with a precision that suggests considerable architectural intention. Storage, ritual use, and habitation combined in ways that speak to a society more organized than European accounts typically credited. Their language, or rather, their languages, as each island appears to have had its own variant, was recorded in fragments by Spanish missionaries and administrators after the conquest. The fragments are too thin to permit full reconstruction. Comparative linguistic work has confirmed the Berber connection and illuminated certain structural features, but the vocabulary, the grammar in its full complexity, the range of expression, these are largely gone. The conquest itself was neither swift nor simple. The Spanish campaign to subdue the islands began in earnest in the late 14th century and was not completed until 1496, nearly a century later. The Guanches of some islands resisted with a persistence that surprised their colonizers, fighting from terrain they knew intimately, using tactics that compensated for their technological disadvantage with local knowledge and physical endurance. Accounts of individual Guanche leaders, particularly on Tenerife and Gran Canaria, describe figures of considerable strategic intelligence and personal courage. Those accounts were written by the people who defeated them. What the Guanches thought of the encounter, what they understood about what was happening to their world, how they interpreted the arrival of people from a continent their oral tradition may have preserved only as distant memory, is not recorded in any voice that was theirs. After the conquest, the surviving Guanche population was absorbed into the colonial society through a combination of intermarriage, forced labor, and the slow dissolution of cultural practice that follows when a community loses the political and physical space to transmit itself to the next generation. Within a few generations, the Guanches as a distinct cultural entity had effectively ceased to exist. Their DNA persists in the population of the modern Canary Islands at measurable levels. Their place names survive partially in the landscape. A few of their words entered the Spanish spoken on the islands, and somewhere in the volcanic rock of those islands, in the cave complexes not yet fully excavated, in the burial sites not yet fully analyzed, in the oral traditions that were imperfectly recorded and then forgotten, something of what they knew about themselves and about the world they had built across 2,000 years of isolation is still waiting to be found. Whether we will find enough of it to hear their own account of who they were is a question that grows more difficult to answer with every generation that passes. The Guanches left their DNA in the soil of islands they could no longer leave, their voices surviving only in the records of the people who displaced them. It is a familiar architecture of loss, a civilization known primarily through the perspective of those who encountered it from outside, filtered through assumptions and agendas that had nothing to do with understanding and everything to do with justifying. What follows shares that architecture, but adds a layer the Guanches did not have, because this civilization was not merely recorded by its conquerors. It was remembered by them with a particular intensity of feeling, with the kind of hatred that suggests the memory was still raw, still capable of generating heat, centuries after the fact. The Nile Delta, Egypt. Sometime around 1650 BC, the delta in this period was not the unified, pharaoh-administered territory that dominates the popular image of ancient Egypt. It was a porous, complicated landscape, marshes and river channels and fertile agricultural land spreading outward from the main body of the Nile toward the Mediterranean coast. It was a place where peoples moved, settled, traded, and accumulated over generations. A borderland in the deepest sense, not a frontier between two defined territories, but a zone where the categories themselves were perpetually negotiating their own edges. Into this landscape, over a period of decades or possibly generations, came people the Egyptians would later call the Hyksos. The word itself is contested. It derives from an Egyptian phrase, Hekakasut, meaning something like rulers of foreign lands or chieftains of hill countries. It was not a name the Hyksos used for themselves. It was a name applied to them by Egyptians, and like most names applied by one people to another from a position of subsequent hostility, it tells us more about the naming than the named. Who the Hyksos actually were, where they originated, what languages they spoke, what gods they worshipped before they encountered Egypt's. is a question that archaeology has been refining for decades without fully resolving. The genetic evidence, still emerging, points toward origins in the Levant, the coastal and inland regions of what is now Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine. They appear to have arrived not as a conquering army in a single dramatic invasion, but gradually, through migration and settlement, accumulating presence in the delta over a long period before consolidating political power. Their capital was Avaris. Built on a strategic branch of the Nile in the eastern delta, Avaris grew from a settlement into a city of considerable size and sophistication. Archaeological excavations at the site, now identified as Tel El Daba, led most prominently by the Austrian archaeologist Manfred Bietak over several decades, have revealed a city that was, at its height, one of the largest in the ancient Near East. Its population may have reached 30,000 or more. Its harbor facilities were among the most extensive in the region, and its palace walls were decorated with Minoan frescoes. This detail, which emerged from excavations in the 1990s, remains one of the most discussed and least resolved findings in the archaeology of the period. The frescoes at Avaris, depicting bull leaping, acrobatics, hunting scenes rendered in the unmistakable visual vocabulary of Minoan Crete, are among the finest examples of Minoan painting ever found outside Crete itself. They are not copies or approximations. They appear to have been executed by Minoan artists working in their own tradition in the capital of a Hyksos kingdom in the Egyptian delta. What this means, what the connection between the Hyksos and the Minoans actually was, whether it represents a diplomatic alliance, a dynastic marriage, a trading relationship, or something else entirely, is not established. The physical evidence is unambiguous. The interpretation remains open. The Hyksos ruled Egypt, or at least the northern portion of it, for roughly a century, from approximately 1650 to 1550 BC. This period is known as the Second Intermediate Period, a designation that already encodes a particular Egyptian perspective, framing the Hyksos presence as an interruption between legitimate dynasties rather than a dynasty in its own right. The Hyksos kings took Egyptian royal titles. They worshipped Egyptian gods alongside their own. They used the Egyptian administrative apparatus. By the material record, they ruled in ways that were more continuous with Egyptian tradition than the later Egyptian memory of them suggested. That memory was savage. When the Theban pharaohs of the 17th and 18th dynasties drove the Hyksos from Egypt, a campaign completed around 1550 BC under Ahmose I, the victors constructed a narrative of liberation from foreign oppression that became one of the foundational stories of Egyptian royal ideology. The Hyksos were characterized as destroyers, desecrators, enemies of the gods. Later texts describe them burning temples and slaughtering sacred animals, claims that the archaeological record does not straightforwardly support. Avaris was not simply conquered, it was systematically dismantled. The city was razed. The Hyksos were expelled. The memory of their presence was worked over, generation by generation, by a royal tradition that needed them to be villains in order for the story of Egyptian restoration to carry its full emotional weight. The result is that the Hyksos are known to us almost entirely through the perspective of the people who hated them. Their own records, whatever administrative texts, royal inscriptions, or literary productions Avaris may have generated during its century as a major capital, have not survived in any meaningful quantity. Whether they were destroyed deliberately, lost in the physical demolition of the city, or simply have not yet been found, is unclear. The excavations at Tel El Daba continue. Each season produces new material. But the Hyksos voice, in any direct form, remains largely absent. There is one thread that some researchers have followed with considerable care and equal controversy. The Hyksos expulsion from Egypt, a population of Levantine origin, driven out of the delta around 1550 BC, has been connected, by a minority of scholars, to the biblical account of the Exodus. The chronology is not precise. The details do not align cleanly. Most mainstream Egyptologists and biblical scholars treat the proposed connection with skepticism, But the structural parallel, a Semitic-speaking people of Levantine origin living in the Egyptian delta, expelled under a hostile pharaoh and moving eastward toward Palestine, has proven difficult to entirely dismiss. Whether there is any genuine historical relationship between the Hyksos expulsion and the traditions preserved in Exodus, or whether the resemblance is coincidental, or whether the biblical narrative absorbed and transformed a cultural memory of events that occurred centuries before its composition, these questions remain genuinely open. What lies beneath the soil of Tel El Daba, in the unexcavated sections of a city that was once among the largest in the ancient world, may yet contain something that changes the shape of the argument, or it may contain only more silence, more beautiful frescoes painted by artists whose names were never recorded, more evidence of a civilization that was deliberately unmade by the people who came after it. The delta keeps its own counsel, and the river, as it always has, continues to move. The delta keeps its secrets beneath layers of silt and time, yielding them slowly, incompletely, on its own terms. Avaris was a civilization of considerable scale, a capital city, a trading hub, a place where Minoan artists painted palace walls. And yet it exists in the record primarily as a wound in Egyptian memory, known through the language of those who needed it to be monstrous. What follows is smaller, considerably smaller, a strip of land so narrow it could be walked across in minutes, populated by a few hundred people at its height, governing itself according to principles so minimal they barely constituted governance at all. And yet it survived, intact and independent, for nearly 4 centuries, outlasting empires, papal edicts, and the reorganization of the Italian peninsula, through a combination of geographical accident and collective stubbornness that history has largely chosen not to notice. The Apennine Hills of central Italy, in the region where Tuscany and Umbria meet, fold into each other in a landscape of steep ridges, narrow valleys, and small streams that have cut their own channels through the limestone over millennia. It is not dramatic terrain in the way of the Alps or the volcanic south. It is quiet, particular, the kind of landscape that rewards close attention, where the difference between one valley and the next can mean a different microclimate, a different soil, a different history entirely. In 1440, a cartographic error changed the history of one such valley permanently. The Papal States and the Republic of Florence were engaged in a territorial negotiation, the kind of administrative boundary drawing that medieval and early modern Italy conducted with exhausting regularity, as overlapping jurisdictions, ancient claims, and practical realities were periodically reconciled into documents that both parties could accept. The boundary between Papal and Florentine territory in this region was to be defined by a river, the Torrente Cerfone. The problem was that there were 2 streams, running close together, both of which could plausibly be called the Cerfone depending on which map you were reading and which local informant you were trusting. The papal negotiators drew their boundary along one stream. The Florentine negotiators drew theirs along the other. Between the 2 lines lay a strip of territory approximately 3 kilometers long and perhaps 300 meters wide at its broadest point. A thin sliver of land containing the small settlement of Cospaia, a handful of farms, and a population that suddenly, through no action of its own, belonged to no one. Neither party claimed it. Neither party, apparently, noticed the discrepancy immediately, and by the time the error was recognized, enough time had passed, enough other matters had accumulated, that the correction was perpetually deferred. Cospaia noticed. The people of the settlement, confronted with the administrative vacuum that had opened beneath their feet, made a choice that is either deeply pragmatic or quietly radical depending on how you look at it. They organized themselves. They established a council of family heads, a loose assembly drawn from the settlement's extended families, that made communal decisions by consensus. They adopted what may be the most concise governing motto in the history of self-governing communities: Perpetua et firma libertas, perpetual and absolute freedom. What this meant in practice was the near total absence of external taxation, military conscription, and legal oversight from any outside authority. Cospaia had no army, No police force, no formal legal system in the conventional sense. Disputes were settled within the community, by the council, according to local custom. The residents paid no taxes to any external power. They owed military service to no one. This should not have worked. Small, undefended communities without formal legal structures occupying territory in the middle of contested Italian politics during one of the most turbulent periods in the peninsula's history. The conditions do not suggest longevity. And yet Cospaia persisted from 1440 until 1826, when it was finally, somewhat reluctantly, absorbed into the Papal States through a negotiated agreement that gave its residents favorable terms and exempted them from certain obligations for a transitional period. 386 years of effective independence for a community that probably never exceeded 300 people. The question of how requires an answer that the conventional political history of the period does not easily supply. Part of the explanation is tobacco. Sometime in the late 16th or early 17th century, the precise date is uncertain, tobacco cultivation arrived in Cospaia. The plant, introduced to Europe from the Americas in the preceding decades, was subject to strict cultivation monopolies across most of the Italian peninsula. The Papal States banned its growth. Florence restricted it heavily. But Cospaia, belonging to neither jurisdiction, could grow it freely, sell it freely, and profit from it in ways that the surrounding territories could not. The Republic became, in effect, a specialized tobacco economy, a tiny free trade zone embedded in the middle of prohibitionist neighbors, generating sufficient commercial activity to sustain its population and sufficient revenue from that activity to make the cost of annexation for the surrounding powers perpetually less attractive than the awkward status quo. But commercial logic alone does not account for 3.5 centuries of survival. The surrounding powers were not passive. The Papal States and their successors were not organizations that typically tolerated anomalies on their borders out of mere administrative inertia. Cospaia was occasionally pressured, occasionally negotiated with, occasionally threatened. It persisted anyway. Some historians have pointed to the settlement's terrain, its position in a fold of hills that made it easy to monitor and difficult to assault without disproportionate effort, as a structural advantage that the community exploited with quiet consistency. Others have suggested that the very smallness of Cospaia made it, paradoxically, more trouble to absorb than to ignore. A community of a few hundred people, generating no significant military threat and a modest but real commercial utility, sitting on land whose legal status was genuinely ambiguous. The administrative cost of resolution may simply have exceeded the administrative benefit for most of the period, and yet something else seems to have been operating as well. The community of Cospaia maintained its internal cohesion across nearly 4 centuries with a consistency that is, on reflection, remarkable. No significant internal revolt is recorded. No faction within the community invited annexation in exchange for political advantage. The Council of Family Heads, an institution with no enforcement mechanism beyond collective agreement, functioned continuously without generating the kind of internal fracture that destroys informal governance arrangements across much of comparable history. How a community sustains that kind of cohesion across generations without formal institutions, without coercive apparatus, without the ordinary machinery of state power, is a question that political theorists have found interesting and historians have found difficult to answer from the available sources. The sources for Cospaia are thin. Local records, such as they were not systematically preserved. The community left no literature, no philosophical articulation of its governing principles beyond that 4-word motto, no account of its own understanding of what it had built and why it endured. What the people of Cospaia thought about their own freedom, whether they theorized it, celebrated it, took it entirely for granted, or understood it primarily as the practical consequence of a cartographic mistake, is simply not recorded. Perpetual and absolute freedom, written in Latin on a document that most of the people it described probably could not read, and sustained, somehow, for nearly 4 centuries, in a strip of land 3 kilometers long, by people whose names history mostly did not think worth keeping. Cospaia survived on the strength of a mistake, and the collective will of people who left almost nothing behind. No literature, no philosophy, no formal record of what they understood themselves to be doing. Their freedom was real, sustained across generations, and almost entirely undocumented from the inside. What follows involves objects that are also real, also undocumented from the inside, and considerably more puzzling. Because unlike Cospaia, whose silence is the silence of a community that simply did not write things down, these objects exist in abundance. They have been found, handled, cataloged, and studied for centuries. They sit in museum display cases across Europe, perfectly preserved, available for examination by anyone with the inclination. And no one knows what they were for. Imagine holding in your hands a hollow bronze object, roughly the size of a large apple. Its surface is formed by 12 pentagonal faces, each one a regular pentagon, each one pierced by a circular hole of a specific diameter. No two holes on the same object necessarily the same size as the others. At each of the object's 20 vertices, where the faces meet, a small bronze knob protrudes, smooth, solid, precisely cast. The whole thing has a satisfying weight. Its geometry is flawless. It was made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. You turn it over in your hands. You look through one of the holes to the interior, hollow, smooth, offering no internal mechanism, no moving parts, no obvious attachment point for any tool or instrument. You set it on a table and it sits there, stable, 12-sided, saying nothing. This is a Roman dodecahedron. More than 100 of them have been found across the former territory of the Roman Empire, concentrated particularly in Gaul, the region covering modern France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of Germany and Switzerland, with additional examples recovered in Britain, the Rhine Valley, and the Danube corridor. The distribution is specific enough to be meaningful. They appear overwhelmingly in the northern and northwestern provinces, the territories Rome conquered and administered, but which were never as thoroughly Romanized as the Italian heartland or the Mediterranean coast. They date broadly to the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. The examples recovered have been found in a range of contexts, some in hoards alongside coins and valuables, suggesting they were considered worth protecting. Some in graves, some in what appear to be domestic settings, some in contexts that provide no interpretive framework at all. Not one has ever been found accompanied by a text explaining its purpose. In the entire corpus of Roman written material, the administrative records, the literary works, the technical manuals, the correspondence, the inscriptions, there is no mention of these objects. A civilization that documented its own military formations, its agricultural techniques, its legal codes, its philosophical arguments, and the construction of its roads and aqueducts in extraordinary detail, left no record of objects it clearly manufactured with considerable skill and in sufficient quantity to distribute across several provinces. The silence is not incidental. It is the central fact of the mystery. The theories that have been proposed over the years range from the practical to the esoteric, and each one encounters evidence it cannot fully account for. The most persistent practical theory is that the dodecahedrons were used as surveying or ranging instruments, that the holes of varying diameters allowed a user to calculate distances by sighting through specific holes at specific distances from a target of known size. This theory has attracted genuine interest and some experimental support. The geometry is compatible with such use. Roman military and engineering practice certainly required instruments of this kind, but no one has demonstrated convincingly a standardized system of use across the range of objects found. The holes vary too idiosyncratically between examples for a single calibrated instrument to explain the full range. And surveying instruments tend to appear in the record. Roman technical writers were not shy about describing their tools. A second category of theories points toward astronomical use. The dodecahedron as an instrument for tracking celestial positions, calculating calendar dates, or identifying the optimal timing for agricultural activity. The 12 faces have suggested, to some researchers, a connection to the zodiac or to the 12 months of the year. The geometry of the regular dodecahedron does have genuine astronomical properties. But again, No ancient text connects these objects to astronomical practice, and no consistent method of use has been demonstrated experimentally across the known examples. Then there are the theories that move away from the practical entirely. The distribution of the dodecahedrons, concentrated in the Celtic-influenced northern and northwestern provinces, has led some researchers to suggest a ritual or religious function connected to the pre-Roman traditions of those regions. The Druids and the broader Celtic religious tradition of Gaul and Britain operated largely outside the written record, deliberately or otherwise, and left almost no direct documentation of their practices. An object connected to ritual use in this tradition would not appear in Roman texts for the same reason it would not appear in Celtic ones, because it belonged to a sphere of practice that neither tradition chose to document in the forms that survive. This theory is attractive in its explanatory reach, but impossible to confirm. We cannot read the absence of documentation as positive evidence of a particular kind of practice. The silence proves nothing except itself. A more recent set of proposals has examined the objects as knitting or textile tools, suggesting that the holes of varying sizes could have been used to gauge the thickness of yarn or to produce tapered gloves of specific dimensions. Experimental archaeology has shown that this use is physically possible. Some researchers find the evidence compelling. Others point out that a bronze object of this geometric complexity, cast with this level of precision, is a remarkably elaborate solution to a problem that simpler tools could address, and that the examples found in hoards alongside coins and jewelry suggest a perceived value inconsistent with a utilitarian textile gauge. What makes the dodecahedrons genuinely resistant to resolution is not that no theory fits. It is that several theories fit partially, none fits completely, and the objects themselves, silent, perfectly formed, distributed across the provinces of a civilization that documented nearly everything else, offer no means of arbitration between competing explanations. Someone made these objects with care and skill. Someone used them, valued them, buried them with other valuables, carried them across the provinces of an empire. They understood what they were. The knowledge was presumably common enough that it required no documentation, the way no one writes down instructions for objects whose purpose everyone already knows. And then, somewhere in the contraction and transformation of the Roman world, that common knowledge simply stopped being transmitted, not destroyed, not suppressed, just discontinued. Left in the ground for us to find, hold, turn over in our hands, and still, after centuries of looking, fail to read. The Roman dodecahedrons sit in their museum cases, perfectly formed and permanently silent, objects whose purpose was common knowledge to the people who made them, and which became, through the simple discontinuation of that knowledge, one of history's most durable puzzles. They require no catastrophe to explain their mystery, no burning of libraries, no deliberate suppression, no colonial erasure. Just the quiet failure of transmission that happens when a civilization stops passing something forward and no one notices until it is too late. What follows involves a document rather than an object. A map drawn on gazelle skin, completed in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis in the city of Gallipoli. It is not lost. It has been sitting in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul since its rediscovery in 1929. It can be examined, photographed, analyzed. It has been all of these things, repeatedly, by scholars across multiple disciplines, and it has not stopped being strange. The map itself is a fragment. Piri Reis noted in his own annotations that it was one section of a larger world map, the rest of which has never been found. What survives shows the Atlantic Ocean, with the western coastlines of Europe and Africa on the right side and the eastern coastlines of the Americas on the left. This alone would be remarkable for 1513. Only 21 years after Columbus's first voyage, the cartographic knowledge of the New World was fragmented, partial, and deeply inconsistent between different European sources. But the Americas on the Piri Reis Map are rendered with a geographic specificity that does not straightforwardly correspond to what European explorers had documented by that date. The Caribbean islands are present. The eastern coast of South America curves southward with reasonable accuracy. And then, at the bottom of the map, something appears that has generated more debate than almost any other feature in the history of cartography: a landmass. Running along the southern edge of the map in a continuous line, separated from South America by a channel of water, extending eastward across the bottom of the image with bays, inlets, and geographic features rendered in some detail. Piri Reis, in his annotations, does not name this landmass with any term that corresponds to Antarctica, but the position is suggestive. The shape, in certain projections, has struck some researchers as consistent, at least broadly, with the coastline of the Antarctic continent. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. Its ice-free coastline, the actual rock beneath the ice sheets, was not mapped until the seismic surveys of the 20th century. This is where the map's most controversial interpretation begins. In the 1960s, Charles Hapgood, an American academic, published an analysis arguing that the southern landmass on the Piri Reis Map represented an accurate depiction of the Antarctic coastline as it would have appeared before glaciation, before the ice sheets accumulated to their current depth, rendering the underlying topography inaccessible to surface observation. Hapgood argued that the level of accuracy implied the existence of a source map, or maps, that predated both the European age of exploration and the known history of Antarctic contact, possibly by thousands of years. This argument became one of the foundational texts of what is sometimes called alternative history, a body of thought proposing that a technologically sophisticated civilization existed in deep prehistory and was subsequently lost, leaving only fragmentary traces in later documents and structures. The mainstream scholarly response to Hapgood's analysis has been, almost uniformly, dismissive. Cartographers and historians of science have pointed out that the correspondence between the Piri Reis southern landmass and Antarctica is less precise than Hapgood suggested, that it requires significant manipulation of projection and scale to achieve even the approximate alignment he claimed. They argue that the southern landmass is more plausibly understood as a representation of the theoretical southern continent, Terra Australis Incognita, that European geographic tradition had posited since antiquity as a necessary counterweight to the landmasses of the northern hemisphere. Maps of this period routinely included such a landmass as a conceptual placeholder based on theoretical reasoning rather than observed geography. This explanation is the mainstream consensus, and it is grounded in a genuine tradition of European cartographic theory that demonstrably influenced mapmakers of the period. And yet the debate does not entirely close, because Piri Reis himself was explicit in his annotations about his sources. He described compiling the map from a large number of existing charts, Arab maps, Portuguese charts of the newly explored coasts, and, most intriguingly, a series of maps that he attributed to Christopher Columbus, some of which he said Columbus had based on even older sources. The annotation is specific enough to suggest genuine archival work rather than invention. What those older sources were, where they originated, and what geographic knowledge they actually encoded is not established. Most of the maps Piri Reis described have not survived. The question of what he was working from and what chain of transmission connected his sources to whatever original observations they represented is genuinely open. There is a separate, less sensational, but perhaps more interesting line of inquiry that the Piri Reis map opens. The map's depiction of the South American coast, while imperfect, is in certain respects more accurate than the European cartographic record of 1513 should allow. Some features that would not be confirmed by European exploration until years or decades after 1513 appear to be present in outline. Whether this reflects lucky extrapolation, access to Portuguese charts that were never made public, the incorporation of indigenous geographic knowledge that European navigators had gathered and transmitted informally, or something else, is a question that the surviving documentation does not cleanly answer. Portugal, in particular, maintained a policy of cartographic secrecy during the age of exploration that was close to absolute. Charts of newly discovered territories were state secrets, guarded with the kind of institutional seriousness that only commercial and military empires apply to genuinely valuable information. The possibility that Portuguese geographic knowledge of South America in 1513 exceeded what is visible in the public cartographic record of the period is not implausible. And Piri Reis, as an Ottoman admiral engaged in active naval intelligence gathering, had both the motivation and the connections to access information that did not appear in sources that have survived. The map, in other words, may be mysterious not because it encodes the knowledge of a lost civilization, but because it accurately reflects the knowledge of existing civilizations that chose not to make that knowledge public. Which raises its own quiet question. How much of what we call mystery is simply the gap between what was known and what was recorded, between the full extent of human understanding at any given moment and the fragment of it that found its way into documents that survived? The gazelle skin sits in Istanbul. The southern landmass waits at the bottom of the map, ambiguous and still, meaning different things to different people depending on what they are prepared to believe the past was capable of. The Piri Reis Map leaves us with a question that has no clean answer. The gap between what was known and what was recorded, between the full reach of human understanding at any given moment and the narrow fragment of it that found its way into documents that survived. It is a gap that runs through everything we have explored tonight. The Dodecahedrons, the Cathars, the Guanches, the women whose names the archive declined to keep. All of them exist in that space between knowledge and record, between experience and transmission. What follows pushes that gap further, considerably further, into territory where the question of what was known, and by whom, and when, becomes genuinely destabilizing, if the objects in question are what some researchers have claimed them to be. The Ica Valley, Peru. A desert landscape on the southern coast, where the land is so dry that organic material survives for centuries without decay, where the Nazca lines are etched into the earth not far to the south, where the soil gives up artifacts the way other regions give up rain, slowly, selectively, as though the ground itself is making decisions about what to release. The stones began appearing in significant numbers in the 1960s. They are river stones, primarily, smooth andesite cobbles of varying sizes, some small enough to fit in a palm, others large enough to require both hands. Their surface, dark and naturally polished by water and time, has been engraved with images. Lines cut into the oxidized exterior reveal the lighter stone beneath, creating images of considerable clarity and, in many cases, considerable complexity. The collection most associated with the Ica Stones belonged to a local physician named Javier Cabrera d'Arquea, who began acquiring them in the 1960s and eventually assembled a private museum containing tens of thousands of examples. Cabrera claimed the stones depicted scenes of advanced surgery, astronomical observation, maps of unknown continents, and most controversially, human figures interacting with dinosaurs. This last claim is the one that has driven the most intense debate and the most intense skepticism. The images on certain stones do appear to show large reptilian creatures alongside human figures. Creatures with body shapes that have been compared, by those sympathetic to Cabrera's interpretations, to sauropod dinosaurs, theropods, and pterosaurs. Non-avian dinosaurs went extinct approximately 66 million years ago. If these images represent genuine ancient knowledge of living dinosaurs, the implications for the established timeline of human prehistory would be, to put it carefully, significant. The mainstream scientific and archaeological response has been consistent and largely dismissive. The primary objection is provenance. The vast majority of the stones in Cabrera's collection and in similar collections were not recovered from controlled archaeological excavations. They were purchased from local farmers and informal dealers, often from the Ica region, without documentation of where or how they were found. Without stratigraphic context, without knowing what layer of soil they came from, what other materials surrounded them, what their physical relationship to datable archaeological material was. The stones cannot be assigned an age through conventional archaeological methods. And when investigators in the 1970s and 1980s began examining the situation directly, they found evidence that was deeply problematic for any ancient origin claim. Local farmers, when interviewed, acknowledged that they had been producing engraved stones for sale to collectors and tourists. The Ica region had experienced economic hardship, and the market created by Cabrera's collecting activity had generated a straightforward financial incentive for production of exactly the kind of material he was seeking. Several individuals demonstrated the engraving technique on fresh stones. When authorities threatened prosecution for selling archaeological artifacts, farmers clarified that the stones were not ancient. They had made them. This testimony, combined with the absence of controlled excavation data and the known market for such objects, led the mainstream archaeological community to conclude that the Ica stones are, in their great majority, modern fabrications, tourist art, and opportunistic production that found an unusually receptive collector in Cabrera. This conclusion is reasonable given the evidence available. It may well be correct. But the story does not end there entirely cleanly, and the researchers who have continued to examine the question have identified a number of details that the straightforward forgery explanation handles less comfortably than its proponents sometimes suggest. First, there is the question of scale. Cabrera's collection alone contained somewhere between 11 and 15,000 stones. The collections of other regional collectors add thousands more. The total number of engraved stones associated with the Ica phenomenon across all collections is estimated at between 50 and 100,000. The economic incentive for production is clear, but the sheer volume raises questions about the time frame in which modern production could account for the entire corpus, particularly given that Cabrera was acquiring stones intensively from the early 1960s, and many of the stones in his collection show surface oxidation and patination that some observers found inconsistent with recent manufacture. Oxidation analysis on andesite is not, however, a sufficiently precise or standardized method to serve as definitive evidence of age. The patination argument has been made and contested without resolution. Second, there is a subset of stones that were reportedly recovered from controlled or semi-controlled excavation contexts, found alongside other material in situations where the stratigraphic position was at least partially documented. These represent a small fraction of the total corpus, and the documentation is not of the standard that would satisfy a peer-reviewed archaeological publication. But they exist as a category distinct from the bulk of dealer-sourced material, and some researchers argue they deserve more careful attention than the broader dismissal of the collection has typically allowed. Third, and perhaps most interesting from a purely scholarly perspective, is the question of what the stones depict beyond the dinosaur images. A significant portion of the corpus shows scenes that are more culturally and historically interpretable, images consistent with pre-Columbian Andean iconographic traditions, figures engaged in activities recognizable from the broader material culture of the region, ceremonial scenes with visual vocabularies that connect to known archaeological contexts. These images have received considerably less attention than the dinosaur scenes, partly because they are less sensational, and partly because their cultural context makes them harder to use as evidence for extreme antiquity claims. But they raise a different question. If the entire corpus is modern fabrication, it is fabrication that drew, at least in part, on detailed knowledge of pre-Columbian Andean visual culture. Knowledge that the farmers producing tourist goods for a collector's market may or may not have possessed at the level of detail evident in some examples. Cabrera himself developed an elaborate theory about the stones, arguing that they were the legacy of an ancient advanced civilization he called the Glyptolithic culture, which he believed had achieved levels of medical and astronomical knowledge that anticipated modern science by hundreds of thousands of years. The surgical scenes on some stones, which appear to show organ transplantation, blood transfusion, and cranial procedures, were central to this theory. Cabrera was a physician, and his reading of these scenes was medically informed, if spectacularly unverifiable. Most researchers consider his theoretical framework to be unsupportable, a construction built on objects whose authenticity has not been established, and whose claimed age has no evidentiary foundation. The theory has found an audience in alternative history literature, but almost none in academic archaeology or anthropology. And yet the stones themselves, the physical objects, whatever their origin, continue to present interpretive challenges that the clean forgery narrative does not entirely dissolve. Because even if the majority of the corpus was produced by local farmers in the 1960s and afterward, the question of what they were drawing on remains at least partially open. Some of the iconography is consistent with genuine regional traditions. Some of the anatomical scenes show a level of observational detail that is difficult to account for through casual invention. The dinosaur images, whether derived from fossil observations, from pictorial sources the producers had access to, or from something else entirely, are at minimum an interesting cultural artifact of the period in which they were made. What the Ica Stones ultimately represent, in their totality, across the full range of the corpus, from the pieces most likely to be recent fabrications to the small subset with the most credible provenance claims, is a question that has not been settled by dismissal any more than it has been settled by the theories of their most enthusiastic proponents. The valley is still there. The stones are still being found or produced or both. The desert preserves things with an indifference to their significance, ancient and recent, genuine and fabricated, sitting side by side in the dry soil with no visible distinction between them. And the possibility that somewhere within the corpus, beneath the tourist production, beneath the economic incentive, beneath the decades of contamination that followed Cabrera's collecting frenzy, there are stones whose origin and meaning have not yet been correctly read, is one that the evidence neither confirms nor entirely eliminates. Some questions remain open not because we lack the tools to close them, but because the material itself is too compromised, too layered with subsequent human activity, to yield a clean answer. The desert keeps what it keeps, and the engravings look up from the stone surface with the same silence they have always maintained, waiting, perhaps, for a question we have not yet thought to ask. The Ica Stones leave us in a familiar position, standing at the edge of a question that the available evidence cannot close, looking into a corpus of objects too contaminated by subsequent human activity to yield a clean answer. The desert preserves without discriminating. It holds the genuine and the fabricated in the same dry silence, offering no guidance about which is which. What follows involves a single object rather than tens of thousands. One piece of linen cloth, 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide, kept in a climate-controlled silver casket in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. It has been examined by more scientists, using more instruments, over more decades, than perhaps any other artifact in human history. The question of what it is remains, depending on who you ask, either definitively settled or genuinely open. This disagreement, between people looking at the same object, using rigorous methods, reaching incompatible conclusions, is itself the most interesting thing about it. The cloth bears the image of a man, full length, front and back, as though a body was laid on one half of the fabric and the other half folded over it. The figure is tall, approximately 5 feet 11 inches by modern estimation. The image shows a bearded man with long hair, his hands crossed over the lower abdomen, his body bearing marks consistent with severe physical trauma. There are what appear to be puncture wounds at the wrists and feet, marks consistent with a crown of thorns around the head, a wound in the side consistent with a lance or blade, scourge marks across the back and legs, distributed in a pattern consistent with the Roman flagrum, a whip with multiple leather thongs tipped with lead or bone. The correspondence between these marks and the Passion narrative of the Christian Gospels is exact. This correspondence is either the most significant fact about the shroud or the most suspicious one, depending on the framework you bring to it. The cloth's documented history begins in 14th century France, when it appeared in the possession of a knight named Geoffroy de Charny around 1354 in the town of Lirey. De Charny died at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, without ever explaining where the cloth came from or what he believed it to be. His widow placed it on public display. Pilgrims came. The local bishop wrote to the Pope expressing concern, stating that an artist had confessed to painting the image. The Pope's response was cautious. He allowed the displays to continue, but required that the cloth be presented as a representation rather than the genuine article. The artist's confession has never been corroborated. The bishop's letter exists. The artist does not in any document that names or further identifies them. From Lirae, the cloth passed through several hands before reaching the House of Savoy in the 15th century, and eventually the city of Turin in 1578, where it has remained. In 1532, a fire damaged a corner of the cloth. The burn marks and water stains from that event are clearly visible today, repaired in the 16th century by poor Clare nuns, whose patches remain part of the fabric's surface. The scientific examination of the shroud began in earnest in 1898, when an Italian photographer named Secondo Pia was permitted to photograph it during a public exhibition. When he developed his glass plate negatives, he found that the negative image, the reverse tones of the photograph, showed the figure with a clarity and three-dimensional coherence that the cloth's direct image did not possess. The shroud image, in other words, behaves like a photographic negative. It contains more information than is visible to the naked eye. Pia reportedly nearly dropped the plate in shock. This property, the negative character of the image, has no satisfactory explanation within any medieval artistic technique so far proposed. In 1988, samples from the corner of the cloth were submitted to 3 independent radiocarbon dating laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Tucson. All 3 returned dates placing the linen's origin between 1260 and 1390 AD, consistent with the 14th century documentary record. The result was announced with considerable confidence. The shroud, the scientific consensus declared, was a medieval forgery. The matter should have been closed. It was not closed, and the reasons it was not closed are more scientifically interesting than the dismissive account of the controversy typically acknowledges. Researchers subsequently raised questions about the specific samples used in the 1988 testing. The samples were taken from a single corner of the cloth, the same corner that had been handled most extensively during centuries of public display, and that bore visible evidence of the 16th century repairs. Textile analysts, most notably the late Raymond Rogers of Los Alamos National Laboratory, published peer-reviewed research arguing that the corner samples contained cotton fibers and a chemical composition distinct from the main body of the cloth. Consistent, he argued, with a medieval repair using different thread that had been dyed to match the original linen. If the samples tested in 1988 were not representative of the main cloth, if they came from a repaired section rather than the original fabric, the radiocarbon dates would reflect the age of the repair material rather than the cloth itself. Rogers's findings were published in the journal Thermochimica Acta in 2005. They have not been refuted in the peer-reviewed literature, though they have been contested. The scientific community remains divided on whether the sampling was contaminated in the way Rogers described. The image itself continues to resist explanation. The most intensive scientific examination of the shroud was conducted by the Shroud of Turin Research Project, STURP, a team of American scientists who spent 5 days in direct examination of the cloth in 1978, using instruments including X-ray fluorescence, infrared spectroscopy, and ultraviolet photography. Their 1981 summary concluded that the image was not painted, drawn, or produced by any artistic medium they could identify. The image resides on the very surface of the linen fibers, the outermost layer of individual threads, without any binding medium, without any pigment penetrating into the fiber itself. The color is a chemical alteration of the fiber surface, not an application of any substance to it. How a medieval forger, working in a period with no photographic technology, no knowledge of negative imaging, no understanding of the chemical dehydration of cellulose that produces the image's optical properties, produce this result is a question that the forgery hypothesis has not answered to the satisfaction of the scientists who examined the cloth most closely. The three-dimensional information encoded in the image has added another layer of complexity. In the 1970s, researchers applied image analysis software developed for NASA's space program to photographs of the shroud and found that the tonal variations in the image encode distance information, that the cloth's image responds to three-dimensional mapping software in a way that painted or photographed images do not. The image appears to contain spatial data about the body it covered, as though the distance between cloth and skin at each point influenced the intensity of the image at that point. No artistic technique produces this property. No known natural process fully accounts for it either, though several have been proposed, from the action of burial gases to the energy released during, as some researchers have suggested with varying degrees of seriousness, a resurrection event that modern physics has no framework to describe. That last suggestion sits at the outer edge of what scientific language can engage with. It is mentioned here not as a conclusion, but as an illustration of how far the genuine scientific puzzles of the Shroud have pushed some researchers toward hypotheses that require the rethinking not just of the object's origin, but of the category of phenomena it might represent. The image of the face on the Shroud is the detail that most arrests extended looking. It is not idealized in the way of painted religious portraits. The features are specific, asymmetrical, bearing marks of swelling and trauma, the eyes closed in a way that suggests coins or pottery fragments placed over them in the burial custom of the period. Forensic pathologists who have examined it describe a face consistent with severe beating prior to death. The specificity of suffering is not what a medieval forger celebrating a religious icon would typically choose to produce. Whether this specificity is evidence of authenticity, evidence of sophisticated artistic intent, or evidence of something else entirely is a question the object has been asked, in one form or another, for centuries. The cloth itself does not answer. It holds its image on the surface of its fibers, neither confirming nor denying, enduring examination after examination with a patience that the object, of course, cannot be credited with, but which feels, in the accumulation of centuries, like something close to it. What was wrapped in this cloth, whether a body, a statue, a deliberate artistic composition, or something the categories available to us cannot yet accommodate, is a question that the most sophisticated scientific tools of the last century have not resolved. The linen waits in Turin, and the image on its surface looks up at the light with closed eyes, as it has for as long as anyone has been certain it existed, offering nothing beyond itself. The Shroud of Turin holds its silence in a climate-controlled casket in Turin, examined and re-examined, its image encoded on fibers in ways that the most sophisticated instruments of the last century have not fully explained. It is an object that exists at the intersection of faith and science, of history and mystery, and it refuses, with what feels like deliberate patience, to resolve into either category cleanly. What follows moves in a different direction, not toward the sacred or the medieval, but toward something far older. Older than human civilization. Older than the human species. Older by several orders of magnitude than anything we have considered tonight. We move to South Africa, to the high-veld plateau of the Northwest Province in the region around the town of Ottosdal, where the landscape is wide and flat, and the sky at evening occupies more of the visual field than the earth beneath it. The geology here is ancient, Precambrian rock, formed during an era of the planet's history so remote that the forms of life present on Earth at the time were largely single-celled, photosynthesizing in shallow seas, leaving no bones, no shells, no traces legible to anything but the most specialized chemical analysis. The rock being mined in this region is pyrophyllite, a soft metamorphic mineral, commercially useful, extracted from deposits that formed approximately 3 billion years ago. Inside this rock, miners have been finding spheres. They are small, typically between 1 and 10 centimeters in diameter. They are hard, considerably harder than the surrounding pyrophyllite matrix in which they are embedded. Their color ranges from dark reddish-brown to metallic blue-gray, depending on composition. Some are solid. Others, when opened or when naturally fractured, reveal a hollow interior with a white, spongy material. Their surface, in the most discussed examples, is marked by grooves, typically 3 parallel grooves running around the circumference of the sphere, evenly spaced, forming a band around the object's equator. These grooves are the detail that has generated the most sustained attention and the most intense disagreement. Miners in the Ottosdal region have been collecting these objects for decades. Some found their way into the hands of researchers and journalists in the 1980s, and the objects began appearing in alternative history literature under a name that has since become standard. The Klerksdorp Spheres, after the nearest major town to the mining area. The claims made about them in that literature were extraordinary. Some writers argued that the spheres were manufactured objects, artifacts produced by an intelligent civilization that existed on Earth 3 billion years ago, when the scientific consensus holds that complex life had not yet evolved anywhere on the planet. The precision of the grooves in this reading was evidence of intentional craftsmanship. The hardness of the material relative to its matrix was presented as evidence of non-natural origin. The spherical form itself was cited as something geology was unlikely to produce spontaneously. The mainstream scientific response addressed these claims directly and, from a geological standpoint, comprehensively. Geologists identified the spheres as a known phenomenon, concretions, formed by the natural precipitation of minerals around a nucleus in sedimentary or metamorphic rock. Concretion formation is a well-documented process that can produce remarkably regular spherical shapes through purely chemical and physical mechanisms. The hardness differential between the concretions and the surrounding matrix is a predictable consequence of the mineralogical differences between the concretion material and the periphelite. Specifically, the spheres appear to be composed largely of wollastonite and hematite, minerals that are significantly harder than pyrophyllite under any conditions. The 3 billion year age of the surrounding rock does not, in this explanation, indicate the age of the concretions themselves. Concretions can form at various points in a rock's history, not necessarily at the moment of the rock's original formation. The spheres may be considerably younger than the matrix that contains them, though precisely how much younger has not been definitively established. This explanation addresses the basic claims of artificial manufacture satisfactorily, and most geologists consider the matter resolved at this level. But the grooves remain the most discussed feature, and the geological explanation for them is less uniformly agreed upon than the concretion explanation for the sphere's general form. Some researchers have proposed that the grooves are the result of natural processes, that differential weathering along planes of weakness in the concretion material could produce groove-like features as the sphere develops or as surrounding material erodes. Others have suggested that the grooves form along the boundaries between different growth stages of the concretion, where compositional changes in the precipitating minerals create lines of differential hardness that express as visible grooves on the surface. These explanations are geologically plausible. They have been offered by credentialed researchers. They have not, however, been demonstrated in a way that fully accounts for the specific character of the grooves on the most discussed examples. Their regularity, their spacing, their consistent positioning around the equatorial circumference of spheres that are themselves remarkably consistent in shape. The most frequently cited example in alternative history literature is a sphere held by Roelf Marx, a museum curator in Klerksdorp, who was among the first to draw wider attention to the objects. Marx noted in interviews conducted in the 1980s that the sphere in his possession was balanced to a degree of precision that he found difficult to account for naturally, that it sat in a specific orientation with a stability he associated with precise geometric balance rather than random natural form. Claims circulated that NASA had examined the spheres and found them balanced to tolerances that exceeded the precision of modern manufacturing. These claims were repeated extensively in alternative history publications and websites. They were not accurate. No documented NASA examination of the Klerksdorp Spheres exists in any verifiable form. The claim appears to have originated in a misattribution or fabrication that was then transmitted through the alternative history literature without verification. This does not speak well for the standards of the literature that carried it, and it has been used reasonably by mainstream scientists to dismiss the broader claims about the spheres as a category of unreliable popular myth. But the dismissal of a false claim does not itself establish the truth of the counter-explanation. What is actually known about the grooves, their precise geometry across the full range of specimens, the specific mechanism of their formation, the degree to which the natural concretion explanation accounts for their character in the most regular examples, is not as completely documented in the peer-reviewed geological literature as the confidence of the mainstream dismissal sometimes implies. The spheres have not received the kind of sustained, rigorous, multi-method scientific examination that the Shroud of Turin received from Sturp in 1978, They are not considered significant enough by the institutions that conduct such examinations to merit that level of investment. They are geological curiosities, classified and explained within existing frameworks, and the classification has been allowed to stand largely because the alternative, taking the extraordinary claims seriously enough to test them rigorously, would require engaging with a body of literature that mainstream science finds methodologically embarrassing. This is not an accusation of conspiracy. It is a description of how scientific prioritization works in practice. Resources for investigation are finite. Objects that appear to fit existing explanations are not, as a rule, subjected to exhaustive analysis. The sociology of science shapes what gets examined as much as the intrinsic properties of the objects under consideration. The result is a situation where the geological explanation for the Klerksdorp Spheres is credible, but not exhaustively verified, and the alternative claims about them are largely unsupportable, but have not been comprehensively refuted in the specific terms their proponents would require. 3 billion years is a number that resists genuine comprehension. It is not a historical period. It is not even a geological period in the sense that most people understand geological time. It is deep time, the time before the Cambrian explosion, before multicellular animals, before the oxygenation of the atmosphere had progressed far enough to support the kind of life that leaves fossils. If the spheres are natural concretions, which remains the most scientifically defensible position, they are nonetheless objects that formed in rock 3 billion years old, surviving intact through continental drift, erosion, mountain building, and the full arc of complex life on Earth, to emerge from a mine in South Africa and sit on a museum shelf in Klerksdorp. That is remarkable enough without requiring an ancient civilization to explain it. And if something about the grooves, their regularity, their geometric consistency across multiple specimens, their precise equatorial positioning, has not yet been fully accounted for by the natural explanation, then what the grooves actually are remains a question that the current state of the scientific record has not definitively answered. The rock holds whatever it holds. 3 billion years of silence, and we have been listening for perhaps 30. Whether that is long enough to be certain we have heard everything the stones have to say is a question the stones themselves, of course, cannot answer. But they sit in their cases in Klerksdorp, grooved and patient, formed in a world so ancient it had no name for itself, and they wait, as objects always wait, for the question that will finally ask them the right thing. The Klerksdorp Spheres sit in their cases, grooved and patient, formed in a world so ancient it had no name for itself. Whatever they are, natural concretions shaped by chemistry and pressure across 3 billion years, or something the current explanatory frameworks have not yet fully accounted for, they represent the outer edge of the questions this kind of inquiry can ask. The deep past, before life left legible traces, before human hands existed to shape anything. What follows returns us to human time, to objects unambiguously made by people, found in known archaeological contexts, with documented histories and clear cultural significance. And yet the mystery they carry is no less persistent for being more recent, because what these objects are made of, and how they were made, should not have been possible at the time and place they were produced. Scandinavia and the river systems of medieval Europe, roughly 800 to 1000 AD. The Viking Age is well documented by the standards of the early medieval period. Through Scandinavian sagas, through the horrified accounts of monastic chroniclers whose institutions bore the brunt of Norse raiding, through rune stones and burial mounds, and the physical evidence of a seafaring culture of remarkable technical sophistication. The Vikings were not the cartoon barbarians of popular imagination. They were traders as much as raiders, navigators who reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus, craftspeople whose metalwork, woodwork, and textile production operated at high levels of skill. Their swords were central to their culture in ways that went beyond the purely functional. A sword was wealth, status, identity. It was named, inherited, buried with its owner, referenced in poetry. The production of a good sword was among the most valued technical skills a craftsman could possess. And then there are the Ulfberht Swords, which are in a different category entirely. Approximately 150 to 200 swords bearing the inscription Plus by Ulfberht have been identified across European archaeological collections, found primarily in Scandinavia, the Frankish territories, and the river systems of what is now Germany and the Low Countries, with additional examples recovered as far east as the Volga trade routes. The inscription is inlaid in the blade itself, typically in iron wire or a contrasting metal, running along the upper portion of the blade in a form that functions less like a maker's mark and more like a brand. A name that, over 2 centuries of production, came to signify a specific quality of weapon. The quality is what requires explanation. When metallurgists began systematically analyzing Ulfberht swords in the 20th century, they found something that should not have been there. Medieval European sword production used a material called bloomery iron, metal produced by smelting iron ore with charcoal in a furnace that could not reach temperatures high enough to fully liquefy the iron. The result was a spongy mass of metal, the bloom, that contained slag inclusions, non-metallic impurities distributed through the material. Medieval smiths developed sophisticated techniques for working these blooms, folding and hammering the metal to consolidate it and work out as much slag as possible. The finest pattern-welded swords of the period represent the upper limit of what this process could achieve. Beautiful, functional weapons whose laminated structure was itself a response to the inherent limitations of bloomery iron. The Ulfberht swords are not made of bloomery iron. Analysis has found that the genuine Ulfberht blades, a distinction that matters, as we will return to, are made of steel with a carbon content of approximately 1% and a slag inclusion rate so low as to be essentially negligible. This material is crucible steel, produced by a process in which iron is fully melted at temperatures exceeding 1500 degrees Celsius, allowing carbon to distribute uniformly through the liquid metal and slag to separate out entirely. Crucible steel was known in the ancient world, produced in South Asia, in a tradition that eventually reached Persia and the Islamic world, where it was the basis for the legendary Wootz steel of Damascus blade production. It was a technology of the East, developed in regions with access to specific raw materials and specific technical traditions. It was not supposed to exist in Viking Age Scandinavia. The production of crucible steel requires furnace temperatures that medieval European bloomery technology could not achieve. It requires specific ore compositions and specific process knowledge. There is no evidence in the European metallurgical record of this period for furnace technology capable of producing the material found in the Ulfberht blades. And yet the blades exist. Tested, retested, confirmed by multiple independent analyses using modern spectroscopic methods. The material is what it is. Approximately a third to a half of the swords bearing the Ulfberht inscription, the ones classified as genuine as opposed to later imitations, are made of crucible steel whose composition is not consistent with European production capability of the period. The mainstream explanation points to trade. The Viking trade networks of the 9th and 10th centuries were extraordinary in their reach. Viking traders followed river systems deep into the Eurasian continent, reaching Constantinople through the Dnieper route and the Caspian Sea through the Volga, where they encountered the Islamic world, its merchants, its goods, and its technologies. The Volga trade route in particular passed through or near regions where crucible steel production was an established industry. By this account, the Ulfberht smiths, whoever they were, obtained crucible steel ingots through these eastern trade networks, imported the raw material rather than producing it locally, and used their own smithing skills to work it into blades of exceptional quality. The name Ulfberht on this reading represented not a single maker, but a tradition or workshop lineage that had access to a specific material supply chain, and whose products were subsequently imitated by other smiths using inferior local material, which explains the distribution of lower quality swords bearing the same inscription. This explanation is coherent and consistent with what is known about Viking trade reach. It requires no technological leap beyond what the evidence supports. It is the consensus position, but it raises its own quiet questions. The Volga trade route connected Scandinavia to the Caspian region, where crucible steel was produced. But the physical distance is enormous. The logistical challenges of transporting steel ingots across those distances in the 9th and 10th centuries were real, and the quantity of material represented by 150 to 200 high-quality swords over 2 centuries of production implies a sustained, organized supply relationship, not occasional acquisition, but something closer to a reliable commercial connection maintained across multiple generations. What was the nature of that connection? Who maintained it? How was the quality of the incoming material assessed and guaranteed? The trade route is documented in outline through Arabic accounts of Rus merchants and through the numismatic evidence of Islamic silver found in Scandinavian hoards. But the specific commercial relationships that would have supported systematic crucible steel importation for sword production are not documented at the level of detail that would allow these questions to be answered. There is also the question of what happened to the knowledge. If Viking Age smiths had access to crucible steel through trade networks, and if that material produced weapons of demonstrably superior quality, lighter, more flexible, holding an edge better than anything bloomery iron could provide, why did the tradition not persist and spread? The Ulfberht production appears to have declined in the 11th century, as the Viking Age itself wound down and trade routes were disrupted by political changes across the Eurasian continent. The knowledge of crucible steel in Europe effectively disappears from the record, not to re-emerge until industrial-era metallurgy achieved the temperatures required for independent production. A technology was available. It produced superior results. The people using it were not isolated. They were among the most widely traveled merchants and warriors in the medieval world. And yet it did not propagate through European metalworking practice in the way that genuinely adopted technologies tend to propagate. Whether this represents the loss of a specific trade connection rather than a failure of knowledge transfer, whether the material was always imported rather than locally understood, so that when the supply ended, the capability ended with it, is the interpretation most consistent with the trade route hypothesis. But it means that for somewhere between 1 and 2 centuries, a small number of European smiths working under a single name or tradition were producing weapons whose material properties would not be matched by European metallurgy for another 500 to 600 years. They knew what they had. The swords were prized, traded, buried as treasures, referenced in ways that distinguished them from ordinary weapons. The people who carried them understood that the material was exceptional, even if the technical reasons for that exceptionality were not expressible in the metallurgical language available to them. What the name Ulfberht actually referred to, whether it was a personal name, a workshop designation, a trading company mark, or something else entirely, is not established. No documentary source identifies the Ulfberht makers. No archaeological site has been confirmed as a production location. No smith's grave has been found with tools that would indicate familiarity with crucible steel working. The name is on the blades, inlaid with the care of a maker who understood it carried meaning. Who gave it that meaning, and what they knew about the material they were working, remains, like the blades themselves, sharp, precise, and without a full explanation. The Ulfberht name sits inlaid in steel, precise and unexplained, carried by blades whose material should not have existed in the time and place they were made. The smiths who produced them understood the exceptionality of what they were working with, understood it well enough to mark it, to brand it, to build a reputation around it across 2 centuries of production. And then the supply ended, the knowledge did not transfer, and European metallurgy continued for another 5 centuries without it. There is something quietly devastating about that pattern. The capability that arrives is used with evident sophistication and then disappears without propagating, as though certain kinds of knowledge have their own ecology, dependent on specific conditions that, once disrupted, cannot be reconstructed from memory alone. What follows involves a different kind of knowledge, not metallurgical, but astronomical. Not encoded in the composition of steel, but pressed into the surface of bronze. A disk, buried in a hillside in central Germany, that contains the oldest known concrete depiction of the night sky, and a level of astronomical understanding that its cultural context was not, until its discovery, believed capable of producing. Central Germany. The Ziegelrode Forest, near the town of Nebra in Saxony-Anhalt. The landscape here is rolling, forested, the kind of Central European terrain that carries its history quietly. Roman roads beneath the medieval paths beneath the modern ones. Burial mounds smoothed by centuries of agriculture into barely perceptible rises in otherwise unremarkable fields. The Mittelberg Hill, where the disk was found, has a commanding view of the horizon in multiple directions. A property that, as will become clear, was almost certainly not incidental to why it was chosen as a burial site. In 1999, two illegal treasure hunters using metal detectors on the forested hillside found a deposit of bronze objects buried approximately 60 centimeters below the surface. The deposit included 2 swords, 2 axes, a chisel, fragments of spiral armlets, and the disc. They sold it. It passed through the illegal antiquities market for several years, changing hands multiple times, its significance apparently not immediately recognized by its various possessors or not acknowledged by them. In 2002, archaeologists acting on a tip arranged a sting operation in Basel, Switzerland, where the disc and the associated objects were recovered from dealers. The men who had originally excavated it were subsequently convicted of illegal treasure hunting and cultural property offenses. The recovery of the disc through criminal proceedings rather than controlled excavation created an immediate problem for its scientific assessment. Provenance in archaeology is not merely administrative, it is epistemological. Where an object is found, in what stratigraphic layer, in association with what other materials, tells researchers when it was deposited and what cultural context it belonged to. The Nebra disk had been removed from its context illegally, its precise position destroyed before any archaeologist could record it. Authentication and dating therefore required indirect methods: analysis of the soil adhering to the disk, comparison with the associated objects whose typology could be placed within known Bronze Age sequences, and examination of the corrosion products on the bronze surface itself. The results of these analyses, published in peer-reviewed literature beginning in 2002, placed the disk's burial at approximately 1600 BC, and its manufacture somewhat earlier, around 1800 to 1600 BC. It is, by these dates, approximately 3,600 years old, the oldest known astronomical artifact in the world. The disk itself is 30 centimeters in diameter, roughly the size of a dinner plate. It is made of bronze, and its surface carries inlaid gold symbols that have been applied and modified over what appears to be a series of distinct phases, each phase adding new elements, and in one case removing or repositioning existing ones. In its current state, the disk shows a large circle that has been interpreted as the full moon or the sun, a smaller crescent that represents the moon in one of its phases, a cluster of small dots that corresponds, with striking accuracy, to the Pleiades star cluster as it would have appeared to a Bronze Age observer in Central Europe, a scattering of additional stars or celestial points, 2 curved gold bands along opposite edges of the disk that have been interpreted as horizon arcs, marking the positions of sunrise and sunset at the solstices at the latitude of the Mittelberg site, and at the bottom, a boat, or a solar bark, whose symbolic significance connects the object to a widespread Bronze Age cosmological tradition associating the sun's transit across the sky with a divine vessel. The astronomical precision of the horizon arcs is the detail that has most engaged researchers. The angle subtended by the 2 gold bands, the arc they describe along the disk's edge, corresponds, when the disk is oriented correctly, to the spread between the northern and southern points of sunrise across the year at the latitude of the Mittelberg. In other words, the disk appears to encode specific geographic and astronomical information about the sky as seen from the hill where it was buried. This is not symbolic or approximate. The angular measurement is accurate to a degree that implies deliberate observation and deliberate encoding. Someone watched the horizon from that specific hill, measured the range of the sun's annual movement along it, and built that measurement into the object. The Bronze Age culture of Central Europe, the Unitas culture, to which the disk is attributed by association with the burial typology, was not previously understood to have possessed this level of astronomical sophistication. The Unetis people left no written record. They are known entirely through their material culture, metalwork, burial practices, trade connections evidenced by the distribution of characteristic object types across Europe. They were skilled bronze workers, active traders, clearly participants in the wider network of Bronze Age European exchange. But the gap between sophisticated bronze production and formal astronomical observation capable of measuring solar declination and encoding it in an artifact is a gap that the previous understanding of Unetis culture did not bridge. The disk bridges it. Unexpectedly, without precedent in the prior record, in a way that forced a significant revision of what researchers believed about the intellectual and observational capacities of Bronze Age Central Europe. The specific function of the disk has been discussed extensively. The most developed scholarly interpretation, associated primarily with the archaeoastronomer Harold Meller, proposes that the disk functioned as an agricultural calendar device, that the inclusion of the Pleiades alongside the crescent moon encoded a specific calendrical rule. In the Bronze Age Central European agricultural calendar, the heliacal rising of the Pleiades, their first appearance on the eastern horizon just before dawn after a period of invisibility, coincided with the beginning of spring agricultural activity. The disk, by this reading, provided a method of determining when the lunar calendar had drifted sufficiently from the solar year to require the insertion of an intercalary month, a correction mechanism that kept the agricultural calendar synchronized with the seasons. This interpretation is technically coherent and has been developed in considerable scholarly detail. It positions the disk as a practical instrument, a tool for the management of agricultural time, rather than purely a ceremonial or symbolic object. But other researchers have noted that the Pleiades connection, the lunar crescent, the solar disk, and the barky together constitute a symbolic vocabulary that is not reducible to agricultural calendrics, that the cosmological dimension of the object, its positioning within a broader Bronze Age framework of celestial mythology, involving the sun's journey across the sky and beneath the earth, is as significant as any practical function it may have served. The two interpretations are not mutually exclusive. A single object can be simultaneously a practical instrument and a sacred symbol, can encode functional information within a cosmological framework, serving both purposes in a culture where the division between the technical and the sacred was not the sharp categorical boundary that modern thought typically imposes. The phases of modification visible on the disk's surface suggest that it was an object with an active life, altered, added to, perhaps repurposed over what may have been generations of use or transmission. The horizon arcs were added later than the celestial body symbols. The bark was added later still. Something about the object's meaning or function evolved across the period of its use. Who used it, how it was used in practice, what rituals or procedures accompanied its consultation. These things are not recoverable from the object itself. The culture that made it left no written account of its own understanding. The disk contains the knowledge without the explanation. There is a detail about the burial that researchers have found consistently significant. When the disk was deposited on the Mittelberg, placed in the ground with the two swords, the axes, the armlets, with apparent intentionality. It was oriented so that the horizon arcs would align with sunrise and sunset at the solstices as seen from that specific hill. It was buried pointing correctly, placed in the earth with the same care for celestial accuracy that governed its construction. Someone who understood what the disk was and what it measured and why the orientation mattered, performed that burial, and then covered it over and left it and did not return. Whether the burial was an act of ritual deposition, the object given back to the earth as an offering, or an act of concealment, the object hidden for retrieval that never came, or something else entirely that the categories available to us do not adequately describe, is a question the ground has kept for 3,600 years. The Mittelberg Hill still has its clear view of the horizon. The angles are still correct, and the sky the disk was made to measure is still, each year, moving along the same arc that the people who buried it watched and measured and pressed into gold against a field of darkened bronze. The Nebra disk was buried pointing correctly, oriented with the same precision that governed its construction, placed in the earth by someone who understood what it measured and why the alignment mattered. Then covered over, left. The knowledge that made it meaningful did not survive in any form the record preserved. The disk outlasted the understanding of the people who made it, and arrived in our hands as a question rather than an answer. There is a particular kind of human creation that carries this quality, objects and documents so singular, so far outside the ordinary production of their time and place, that the gap between what they are and what we know about the context that produced them becomes itself the central mystery. Not a gap caused by destruction or deliberate erasure, but by the simple disproportion between an extraordinary thing and the ordinary human life that made it. What follows is the largest surviving medieval manuscript in the world. A book so anomalous in its scale, its content, and the circumstances of its creation that it acquired centuries ago. A second name, one that has followed it ever since, shaping how it is perceived and what questions are asked about it. The Narodní knihovna, the National Library, in Prague, Czech Republic. A reading room where, under controlled conditions, researchers may examine one of the strangest objects European monasticism ever produced. The Codex Gigas, the giant book. The physical dimensions alone are enough to stop anyone who encounters them for the first time. The manuscript measures approximately 90 centimeters tall, 50 centimeters wide, and 22 centimeters thick. It weighs approximately 75 kilograms, roughly 165 pounds. The pages number 310 surviving leaves, with evidence that additional pages were removed at some point in its history, the nature and content of those missing pages unknown. The vellum from which it is made required, by the estimate most commonly cited, the skins of approximately 160 donkeys or calves. It is not a book that can be comfortably held, carried, or read by a single person without considerable physical effort. It was made to be placed, opened, and approached. Its scale is not incidental. It is a statement. The manuscript was created at the Benedictine monastery of Podlajice in Bohemia, in what is now the Czech Republic, sometime in the early 13th century. Estimates cluster around 1200 to 1230 AD, based on paleographic and art historical analysis. It remained at Podlajice until the monastery was dissolved in the mid-13th century, then passed through a series of Bohemian monasteries before being acquired, in 1594, by the Habsburg Emperor Rudolf II, who had a particular appetite for extraordinary and occult objects, and whose collection in Prague Castle was among the most unusual assemblages of artifacts in European history. In 1648, during the final stages of the 30 Years' War, Swedish forces sacked Prague and carried the manuscript to Stockholm as war plunder. It has been in Sweden ever since, held now by the National Library of Sweden, though the Czech Republic has periodically requested its return. The content of the Codex Gigas is, in itself, remarkable and genuinely strange in its combination. It contains, in order, the complete Latin Bible, the Vulgate text in its entirety, the Antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish War by Josephus, the first-century Romano-Jewish historian, a collection of medical works including texts attributed to the physician Constantinus Africanus, a Czech chronicle by the 12th-century monk Cosmas of Prague, a collection of magical formulae and exorcism texts, and a calendar with a necrology, a list of the dead to be commemorated. Various shorter texts and encyclopedic material are interpolated throughout. What makes this combination unusual is not any individual element. All of these texts existed in medieval monastic libraries, but the fact that they were assembled in their entirety within a single enormous volume. The ambition of the project is without parallel in medieval manuscript production. Creating the Codex Gigas required not just the physical labor of preparing vellum and applying ink across years of work, but the organizational and intellectual effort of gathering, copying, and integrating texts from multiple traditions into a unified object. The hand, remarkably, appears to be consistent throughout the entire manuscript. Most large medieval manuscripts were produced by multiple scribes working over extended periods. The division of labor is typically visible in the changing character of the script. The Codex Gigas shows evidence of a single hand from beginning to end. One person copied all of it. Paleographic analysis has estimated, based on the rate at which medieval scribes could produce text of this quality and density, that the copying alone would have required between 20 and 30 years of sustained work, assuming the scribe did nothing else, writing for a significant portion of every working day across decades. This is the foundation of the legend that grew up around the manuscript. A medieval tradition, recorded in a Czech chronicle of the 14th century, held that the Codex Gigas was produced in a single night. The story, in its most developed form, described a monk who had been sentenced to be walled alive for breaking his monastic vows. Facing death, he promised to create, before dawn, a book that would contain all human knowledge and would glorify the monastery forever. He began writing, but as midnight approached, he realized he could not finish in time. He made a pact with the devil. The devil completed the manuscript, and in gratitude the monk included a full-page portrait of his patron within the book itself. The portrait exists. On page 577 of the manuscript, opposite a full-page image of the heavenly city, there is a full-page depiction of the devil, a figure rendered in green and red, arms extended, wearing a crown, his feet visible beneath a frame that the image partially occupies. It is not a marginal doodle or a small decorative element. It is a deliberate, large-scale, carefully executed image, given the same visual weight as the heavenly city facing it. Why a medieval monk, producing a manuscript containing the complete Bible and intended for monastic use, included a full-page portrait of the devil as a central feature of the book, is a question that has not been resolved by any explanation that satisfies all the evidence. The most conventional scholarly interpretation notes that medieval Christian cosmology required the devil to have a place in any complete picture of reality, that the inclusion of the image reflects a theological intent to represent the full scope of creation, including its darkest element, within a comprehensive vision of the world. The facing pages, heaven and hell, the heavenly city and the devil, represent a cosmological duality that medieval thought would have recognized as orthodox rather than transgressive. This interpretation is intellectually coherent and consistent with the content of the broader manuscript, which includes exorcism texts and magical formulae alongside the biblical text, material that, in a medieval monastic context, was understood as part of a comprehensive engagement with reality rather than a departure from religious orthodoxy. But the scale of the devil portrait, its placement, its careful execution, and the specific decision to render it as a visual counterpart to the heavenly city rather than as a subordinate or cautionary image, continues to interest researchers who find the conventional explanation insufficient. The missing pages add another layer of unresolved question. The current manuscript shows evidence of pages that were removed, the stubs of cut or torn leaves visible in the binding. The number of missing pages is estimated at 8. When they were removed, by whom, and what they contained is not documented. The removal could have occurred at any point in the manuscript's history, during its time in Bohemia, during its years in Rudolf II's collection, during the Swedish period, or more recently. The content of those pages is permanently unknown, unless they surface somewhere in an archive or collection that has not yet been searched. 8 pages from a manuscript of this scope could contain almost anything. Additional magical texts, records of the monastery, personal notes from the scribe, images, or material considered too sensitive for preservation in a context where the book might be examined by hostile eyes. The scribe's identity is not established. No colophon, the concluding statement in which medieval scribes sometimes identified themselves, survives in the manuscript. The monk Herman the Recluse has been proposed as a candidate based on a brief reference within the text, but the evidence is ambiguous and the identification is not confirmed. The person who spent perhaps 30 years copying this manuscript, whose hand is present on every page, whose physical labor produced an object of 75 kilograms, did not, as far as the record shows, leave their name in it. Or if they did, it was on one of the missing pages. The giant book sits in Stockholm, preserved in conditions designed to prevent further deterioration, available for scholarly examination, periodically exhibited to the public in controlled circumstances. Its devil watches from page 577 with an expression that medieval artists rendered with the vocabulary available to them. Grotesque, formal, caught in a posture that could be read as menace or supplication depending on what the viewer brings to it. The scribe looked at that image for years while producing it, understood what they were making, chose the scale, the placement, the detail, what they understood themselves to be doing, whether they were completing a theological statement, fulfilling a commission, exercising something, or constructing something whose full meaning they took with them into silence, is a question the manuscript cannot answer from within its own pages. The hand that wrote it is gone. The book remains. The Codex Gigas was made by a single hand across what may have been decades of solitary labor. A scribe whose identity was never recorded, whose name does not survive in the manuscript they spent perhaps a third of their life producing. The book remains. The person is gone, and the 8 missing pages sit as a permanent absence at the edge of whatever the manuscript was fully intended to be. There is something in that pattern, the extraordinary document that arrives without full explanation, whose maker is silent, whose complete meaning requires information that does not survive, that connects to what follows. Another manuscript, another undeciphered text, another object that has occupied the attention of serious researchers for generations without yielding what it most centrally contains. But where the Codex Gigas is large and physically commanding, the object that concerns us now is small, modest even. A book that could be carried under one arm, held in 2 hands, read, if read is the right word, in a single sitting. The Hungarian Academy of Sciences, Budapest. In the Academy's manuscript collection, among documents whose contents are known and catalogued, sits a volume of approximately 448 pages, each approximately 12 by 10 centimeters. Its pages are made of paper rather than vellum. Its binding is worn but intact. On each page, arranged in careful lines, is a text written in a script that no one has been able to read. This is the Rohonc Codex. Its name comes from the town of Rohonc, now Rechnitz, in modern Austria, where it was part of the library of Count Gustav Bathyany. In 1838, Bathyany donated his collection to the Hungarian Academy, and the manuscript came with it. There is no record of how it entered the Bathyany library, when it was acquired, or where it came from before that. The script is unlike any known writing system. It reads, apparently, from right to left. The text is oriented consistently in that direction, and the margins show evidence of the conventions associated with right-to-left writing. But the individual characters do not correspond to any identified alphabet, syllabary, or logographic system in the scholarly literature. The script contains somewhere between 80 and 200 distinct symbols, depending on how individual characters are defined and grouped. A range that in itself reflects the difficulty of analysis, since the boundaries between symbols in an unknown script are not self-evident. Running alongside the text on many pages are illustrations, small drawings, rendered in a style that has been described as naive or folk art in character, but which repays close attention. Scenes of religious significance, figures that appear to represent sun and moon worship, military processions, a crucifixion, landscapes with buildings that suggest a specific cultural context. The illustrations have been the primary source of scholarly attempts to place the manuscript in a cultural tradition, since the text itself has resisted all attempts at decipherment. The crucifixion image is significant because it establishes a Christian connection, or at minimum, a familiarity with Christian iconography. But the sun and moon worship scenes have led other researchers to propose non-Christian or syncretic religious content, suggesting a tradition that combined elements of Christianity with older or parallel belief systems. Some of the figures in the illustrations carry attributes that have been compared to Hindu iconography, leading to occasional suggestions of an Indian origin for the manuscript, a theory that has not gained mainstream acceptance, but has not been definitively closed either. The paper has been analyzed. The results place its manufacture in the late 15th or early 16th century, a dating consistent with the paper composition and the watermarks visible in certain pages. This does not establish when the text was written on the paper, but it provides a terminus post quem. The manuscript cannot have been produced before the paper was made. This dating caused a significant problem for one of the most persistent alternative theories about the manuscript's origin. In the early 19th century, a Hungarian linguist named Antal Vaz proposed that the Rohonc Codex was written in an ancient Hungarian script, a form of the runic writing system known as Szekely Hungarian Rovas, which predated the adoption of the Latin alphabet in Hungary and survived in limited use in Transylvania into the early modern period. This theory was attractive to Hungarian nationalist sentiment of the period, which had an understandable interest in establishing the antiquity and sophistication of pre-Christian Hungarian culture. The dating of the paper to the late 15th century or later was consistent with this theory in principle, but subsequent analysis of the script itself has not supported the Rovas identification. The characters do not match known Rovas symbols with sufficient consistency to support the connection, and the right-to-left directionality, while present in some Rovas inscriptions, does not fully align with the manuscript's textual conventions. The theory that has attracted the most sustained attention in recent decades is considerably less romantic, but no less significant, if correct. Beginning in the early 20th century and gaining momentum with the work of Hungarian historian István Vasari and others, a substantial body of scholarly opinion has moved toward the conclusion that the Rohonc Codex is a forgery, a modern fabrication produced in the early 19th century, most likely by a Hungarian nobleman and antiquarian named Samuel Literati Nemes, who was known to have produced other forged antiquities and who had both the opportunity and the apparent motivation to create the kind of ancient mysterious manuscript that would attract interest and validate nationalist theories of Hungarian cultural antiquity. The forgery hypothesis rests on several observations. The manuscript appears in the historical record only with the Batthyány donation in 1838. There is no documented reference to it from before that date. Literati Nemes had direct connections to the Batthyány collection and was known to have supplied antiquities to Hungarian collectors during exactly the period when the manuscript would have been produced. The illustrations, on close examination, show stylistic features that some researchers find more consistent with 19th century historical pastiche than with genuine medieval production. The forgery hypothesis is now the majority position among professional scholars who have examined the manuscript, and yet it has not produced a consensus sufficiently strong to close the question, because the forgery hypothesis, while it explains the manuscript's sudden appearance in the record, does not explain the script. If Literati Nemes, or any other 19th century forger, invented the Rohonc script, they produced something of considerable ingenuity. The script is internally consistent in ways that are difficult to fake without either genuine linguistic knowledge or an extraordinary investment of creative effort. Statistical analysis of the symbol distribution in the text shows patterns consistent with a natural language, frequency distributions, symbol transitions, the repetition and variation characteristic of structured communication rather than random or semi-random character generation. This does not mean the text encodes a real language. Sophisticated forgers have produced texts with superficially language-like statistical properties that do not decode to meaningful content. The Voynich manuscript, which has occupied cryptographers and linguists for over a century, may or may not represent a similar case. But the internal consistency of the Rohonc script is sophisticated enough that researchers who have argued for the forgery hypothesis have not always been able to explain how a 19th century forger achieved it, or why they would have invested the effort required to produce statistical regularity in an invented script rather than simply producing a visually convincing surface. The illustrations complicate the picture further. The iconographic mixture, Christian, possibly syncretic, with elements that do not clearly correspond to any single European religious tradition, is coherent enough to suggest either a genuine document from a culturally complex context, or an extremely well-informed forgery that drew on multiple source traditions with real scholarly depth. Several attempts at decipherment have been published over the years. None has achieved acceptance. Some researchers have proposed specific language candidates: Vlach, an archaic Romanian dialect, various forms of archaic Hungarian, a Dacian language otherwise unattested, and built partial decipherments on those foundations. None has been reproducible or verifiable in the way that genuine decipherment requires. The manuscript sits in Budapest, accessible to researchers, periodically re-examined with new analytical tools. Digital imaging has allowed detailed study of the illustrations and the script without physical handling. Statistical analyses have been run and rerun. The symbol inventory has been cataloged with increasing precision. The text has not yielded, whether because it encodes something in a language or system that researchers have not yet correctly identified, or because it was constructed to resist decipherment by someone who knew precisely what they were doing, or because it encodes nothing at all. A sophisticated performance of meaning without meaning beneath it is a question that cannot currently be answered. What the Rohonc Codex is, at its most fundamental level, real document or elaborate fabrication, ancient voice or 19th century invention, remains genuinely open. 448 pages of careful, consistent, unreadable text. Illustrations that suggest a world, a belief system, a specific human experience, without naming any of them. And the persistent, unresolvable question of whether the meaning is hidden or was never there.